I used to believe the game belonged to the players. I believed the noise of the stadium and the rhythm of the pads and the echo of bodies colliding were the only truths that mattered. I believed the stories would always be shaped on the field, not above it. I believed the people with the microphones and notebooks were simply witnesses who translated what they saw. Back then, their voices drifted in like harmless background sound, the way a radio hums in the next room. You hear it, but you do not feel it. You recognize it, but you do not follow it. That was the world I grew up with. A world where athletes played and reporters observed, and the line between the two felt permanent. But silence has a way of revealing power. When the crowd fades after a game and the cool night air settles around the stadium, the only voice that remains is the one that tells the story, not the quarterback who threw the final pass, not the coach who drew the play. It is the voice that steps in after the moment and decides what the moment meant. I remember the first time I walked out of a stadium after the broadcast lights clicked off. There was a calm around me, almost like the world was resetting itself. And somewhere in that calm, I noticed how the story was already being rewritten by people who had not taken a single snap. Their words traveled faster than the players had. Their interpretations carried more weight than the bruises still forming under shoulder pads. It was the first time I sensed the shift. The first time I understood that the final word did not belong to the people who sweat for it. It belonged to the people who spoke about it. Before long, it felt like the culture of the game began tilting toward the press box. The voices became sharper. The personalities became larger. The reactions became louder than the events themselves. I remember watching a game where the final drive should have been the headline. A rookie stepping into the spotlight and delivering a performance he would never repeat again. Yet the next morning, all anyone talked about was a sideline reporter who had broken a single sentence of news in the middle of the fourth quarter. The highlight was not the throw, it was the reporter. That was when I realized that the balance of power had begun to shift so quietly that most people never noticed. The moment became secondary to the conversation that followed. And for the first time, the commentators and columnists and insiders began to resemble stars in their own shadows. It seemed innocent at first. Fans simply wanted voices they could trust. Analysts they enjoyed listening to. Reporters who made them feel closer to the game. But trust is a powerful force. Once a reporter becomes the voice fans repeat, that voice begins to shape the story before the players can. I remember when I started hearing people quote journalists instead of athletes. Conversations in bars and living rooms would begin with phrases like, "He said this," or "They reported that." The language of the game shifted. The stories no longer came from the locker room. They came from social feeds and studio sets and late-night news drops. The players still performed. But the journalists began to define the meaning of those performances. Over time, the rise of the journalist celebrity became impossible to ignore. They were no longer just present in the stadium. They hovered above it like unseen guardians of public opinion. They built brands with the same intensity athletes used to build legacies. Some became known for accuracy. Some became known for sensationalism. Some became known simply for being loud. And yet all of them carried a kind of influence that reached deeper than the field they covered. A single rumor could send a franchise into panic. A single leak could shift millions of dollars. A single commentary could redefine how fans viewed a player forever. I sometimes think about the power contained in a whisper from a well-connected journalist. A quiet suggestion that a player is unhappy. A subtle implication that a coach has lost the locker room. A prediction that a trade is coming. These moments are small at first. They spark curiosity. They stir debate. But then the whisper grows, spreads through feeds and screens and conversations until it becomes accepted truth. Meanwhile, the player whose life is being dissected stands there powerless to stop a narrative he never created. I have seen careers change overnight because of one story that caught fire. I have seen locker rooms collapse under the weight of assumptions and opinions that were never confirmed. I have seen the dangerous side of influence when the storyteller becomes more important than the story. There were nights when I would sit alone replaying old broadcasts, trying to remember when the shift truly began. I kept going back to one game that felt ordinary on the surface. Nothing dramatic, nothing historic. But it was the first time I noticed the broadcasters being treated like the main attraction. Fans chanted for them when their faces appeared on the screen. They signed autographs before the players arrived. Children wore shirts with their catchphrases. I remember standing there thinking that the old world of journalism, the one governed by quiet professionalism, had vanished. In its place stood a new version, one where personality was currency and attention was power. The transformation did not happen in a single season. It evolved slowly as technology changed and culture followed. At first, it was the television era that elevated their status. Then, it was 24-hour sports networks that gave them infinite airtime. Later came the digital world, where speed overtook accuracy. And finally, social platforms where the fastest voice became the loudest, and the loudest voice became the most profitable. Through every era, the journalist became more visible, more influential, more essential to the way fans understood the game. What struck me most was how quickly the boundary blurred. Journalists once observed from the outside, now they operated inside the narrative. Sometimes shaping it intentionally, sometimes shaping it without even realizing. They developed followings. They developed alliances. They developed rivalries that played out like their own version of competition. And as their star power grew, their motivations grew more complicated. Some wanted truth. Some wanted access. Some wanted fame. Some wanted all three. And the consequences of those motivations began to ripple through every corner of the sport. I knew the game had changed the moment. I heard a fan say he trusted a particular reporter more than the general manager of his favorite team. It was not said as a joke. It was said as a declaration. The journalist had become a kind of cultural anchor, a familiar voice that provided clarity in a sport filled with chaos. But familiarity can also become dependency, and dependency can become control. It was the first time I asked myself a question that would follow me every season after. When did the narrator become the main character? Looking back, the answer is not simple. The rise of the sports journalist celebrity was not caused by one person or one moment. It was born from a changing world, an expanding media landscape, and an audience that craved connection as much as information. It was the result of a sport that grew beyond the field and became part of daily life. Yet beneath all of that was something deeper. A collective decision to elevate the voice that tells the story until that voice became the story itself. Now when I stand in an empty stadium and feel the quiet settle around me, I think about how much power lives in that silence. The players are gone, the fans are gone, but the story is still taking shape. And the people who shape it have never been more influential. The rise of the journalist celebrity is not just a trend. It is a transformation of the entire world surrounding the game. And this is the story of how that transformation happened and why it matters more than most people realize. When I look back at the history of sports reporting, I often think about how small it all seemed in the beginning. The earliest forms of journalism lived quietly in the margins of newspapers. Columns were tucked between local announcements and weather summaries. Writers were rarely known beyond a small circle of loyal readers. Their words documented the games, but they did not define them. They observed, they described, they recorded. The connection between journalist and audience was distant. The voice of the writer served as a guide, not a force. And for a long time, that was enough. As the decades passed, something subtle began to change. What started as brief summaries written from cramped press boxes grew into full narratives that shaped the public memory of every performance. Reporters traveled with teams. They learned the rhythms of a season. They understood the human side of players long before television ever tried to show it. During the era stretching from the 1970s into the 1980s, the beat writer became the backbone of sports coverage. These journalists lived beside the athletes without ever stepping onto the field. Their stories were honest, personal, and rooted in the belief that the truth came from witnessing things firsthand. There was no fame in it, only dedication, only craft. Then came the era of cable networks, and the world of sports coverage began to widen. By the time the 1990s arrived, television had become the new arena where stories were shaped. Suddenly, the journalist was no longer a name printed in black ink. They were a face speaking directly into living rooms across the country. They had personalities. They had recognizable voices. They had nightly platforms. The distance between reporter and audience shrank, and with that closeness came influence. It was during this period that the first true media stars emerged. They had the ability to redirect national conversations with a single sentence. Fans waited for their commentary the way they once waited for kickoff. And in many ways, this was the moment when the journalist began to evolve from observer into participant. The turn of the century accelerated this transformation more than anyone could have predicted. The rise of the internet turned information into a race against time. Speed became currency. Accuracy mattered, but immediacy often mattered more. Websites competed to be first. Reporters competed to break stories before anyone else could breathe. This created a new type of media figure. Someone who lived in the flow of constant updates. Someone who carried information the moment it arrived. Someone whose value came from access rather than analysis. This was the birth of the insider culture, a world driven by private conversations, unofficial confirmations, and the increasingly powerful network of agents, executives, and team personnel who controlled the flow of information. In the early 2000s, rumors became headlines. Leaks became strategy. Every piece of information, even the smallest detail, held weight. Teams learned to use journalists as tools to shape public perception. Agents learned to use them to increase leverage during contract negotiations. Franchises learned that controlling narratives could be just as important as controlling plays. The insider was no longer a reporter. They were a broker, a negotiator, a distributor of influence. Their words reached millions in seconds. And with every breaking story, their power grew. The world shifted again in the decade that followed. During the years stretching from the early 2010s into the rise of the early 2020s, journalists became more than information sources. They became brands. Their identities extended far beyond traditional reporting. Some built massive followings on social platforms. Some created podcasts that rivaled television shows in audience size. Some became recognizable figures on panels, debates, and broadcasts. Others blurred the line between journalist and entertainer. And a few reached a level of fame once reserved only for the athletes they covered. This evolution changed the way fans consumed the game. Many supporters trusted certain journalists more than team executives or league officials. They believed the reporters who spoke with conviction. They believed the insiders who broke stories first. They believed the commentators who explained the game with confidence. Trust is a fragile thing. It builds slowly, but once it settles in, it becomes a powerful anchor. Entire fan bases leaned on the perspectives of a chosen few voices to understand their teams. These voices shaped excitement. They shaped fear. They shaped anger. They shaped hope. And eventually, they began to shape loyalty itself. There was a moment when I realized how much sway journalism held over the modern fan. It happened during a conversation where someone referenced the opinion of a well-known reporter as if it were fact, even though the comment had been speculative. Truth had become elastic. It could be bent by charisma. It could be influenced by repetition. It could be guided by a voice that carried enough authority. And once fans accepted a version of truth from their preferred journalist, it became nearly impossible to dislodge it. This shift reshaped careers in ways the earlier generations of reporters could never have imagined. A positive narrative could elevate a young player into a star before he had even earned a full season of snaps. A negative narrative could weigh down a veteran who had already built a decade-long legacy. Reporters became narrators of reputation. They could emphasize flaws. They could spotlight strengths. They could magnify controversies. And with every story they told, they added layers to the public identity of the players. Sometimes these layers reflected reality. Other times they reflected perception. The lines separating the two grew thinner every year. When controversies hit the league, journalism often became the lens through which the world interpreted the events. Reporters uncovered details that teams kept hidden. They exposed fractures inside locker rooms. They revealed conflicts that would otherwise never surface. But the same influence that brought truth into the light also carried a darker potential. The pressure to break stories quickly. The pressure to generate engagement. The pressure to maintain insider access. These pressures sometimes caused information to be exaggerated, simplified, or framed in a way that amplified drama. Narratives became tools. Some were curated with care. Others were weaponized with intention or by accident. The results could be profound. As the 21st century unfolded, the relationship between journalists and audiences began to resemble something deeper than simple information exchange. Fans formed personal attachments to media personalities. They followed their daily commentary. They memorized their styles. They defended them against criticism. This created a feedback loop where the journalists responded to the expectations of their audience. Some embraced bold opinions, some leaned into humor. Others embraced the identity of insider authority. Each approach built influence, and influence built power. The rise of the sports journalist celebrity is not only a story about media growth, it is a story about the evolving psychology of the fan. People crave voices they can trust during moments of uncertainty. They look for clarity during seasons of chaos. The modern landscape of sports, with constant movement, massive contracts, scandals, and relentless change, created a hunger for explanation. Journalists filled that space. They offered direction when the game felt overwhelming. They offered answers when teams stayed silent. They offered interpretation when fans needed meaning. This bond made their rise possible. And so this documentary will follow the path that brought us from the quiet world of newspaper coverage to the storm of 24-hour reporting cycles and the undeniable power of journalist celebrities. Over the next 20 batches, we will examine how this transformation unfolded. We will look at the structure of power that emerged behind the scenes. We will study the relationships between journalists, players, agents, executives, and fans. We will explore the ethics of influence, the consequences of access, and the ways narratives shape legacies. We will confront the scandals, conflicts, and controversies that altered careers and shifted public opinion. And we will reflect on how a profession rooted in observation evolved into one of the most influential forces in modern sports. This is the story of how the narrator stepped into the center of the narrative itself. It is a story of power gained quietly, subtly, and sometimes dangerously. And it is a story that continues to reshape the world of football every single day. There was a time when sports felt like a quiet ritual. Stadiums carried their own roar. Locker rooms held their own secrets. And homes across the country absorbed games without expecting anything more than the simple thrill of watching athletes compete. Yet, even in those early years of television, something was forming behind the glow of the screen. A new presence was emerging, a voice that carried the game into the living room in a way that newspapers never could. It arrived not with the force of a star athlete, but with the steady persistence of someone who understood that power in sports was not limited to the field. It could also be found in the telling. The birth of the modern sports media machine began the moment television claimed its place as the dominant storyteller of American culture. Suddenly, the game was no longer confined to stadium seats and neighborhood radios. It lived on the screen, and with that screen came a new type of authority. Early broadcasters stepped into that space with a voice that felt both distant and intimate, a careful balance between reporter and narrator. They were not yet celebrities, not yet icons, but they were the bridge between the viewer and the moment. Their tone shaped how the country understood what it was seeing. Growing up in that era meant recognizing certain voices long before recognizing certain faces. Those voices drifted through living rooms on Sunday afternoons, describing plays with a calm certainty that made them feel almost mythic. Before you ever memorized the names of players, you memorized the cadence of the journalist calling the game. Those early voices taught you the vocabulary of sports. They taught you how to frame a moment, how to understand momentum, how to interpret a season. Their influence was quiet, yet it settled deeply into the culture. Television gave these journalists something no medium had granted before. It gave them presence. Not presence in the celebrity sense, but presence as a trusted companion in the national pastime. And that presence began to grow because the camera did more than show the field. It showed the person explaining it. As networks expanded their coverage, these journalists became familiar figures. Their personalities began to matter. People started to believe that understanding the game required understanding the people narrating it. That was the beginning of access becoming currency. The journalist who could get closer to the locker room, who could secure a conversation with a coach, who could deliver a detail no one else had, became more valuable to the network and more compelling to the audience. This was not yet the era of insider reporting. It was not about scoops or breaking news. It was about proximity. It was about the sense that the journalist stood just behind the curtain, granting viewers a glimpse into a world that had previously been sealed shut. What made this moment so transformative was not simply the rise of television, but the way it redefined the relationship between journalist and audience. The early sports journalist on television did not compete with players for the spotlight. They complemented the athletes by giving context to their performances. They elevated the drama through language. They constructed a story around every game. Without meaning to, they were shaping narrative long before narrative became an explicit tool of influence. Looking back, it becomes clear that this shift was the first step towards something much larger. As these early journalists gained recognition, networks realized that their personalities could anchor broadcasts just as strongly as the games themselves. The studio desk became its own stage. Pre-game shows and halftime reports extended the lifespan of every storyline. What once was a simple lead-in to kickoff now carried its own gravity. The journalist became a fixture, someone viewers felt they needed to hear from before they could fully understand what they were watching. One of the earliest memories many fans share is the experience of hearing these voices before fully grasping the sport itself. Those voices served as teachers. They painted the game in broad strokes of strategy and human emotion. They gave weight to victory and dignity to defeat. They were the guardians of interpretation. And even if we did not understand it at the time, they were subtly shaping the way we would come to view sports for the rest of our lives. As their influence increased, so did the expectations placed upon them. Networks started seeking journalists who were not only knowledgeable but charismatic. Journalists who could hold the viewer's attention in moments when the action paused. This was the era when personality began to intertwine with reporting. It was no longer enough to describe what was happening on the field. The audience wanted insight. They wanted opinions. They wanted the journalist to tell them not just what happened, but what it meant. That shift carried consequences. For the first time, journalists felt the pressure to become interpreters rather than observers. Their commentary began to shape not only public understanding of the game, but the reputations of the people playing it. Athletes started to realize that a single televised remark could influence their public image more than their performance on the field. Coaches understood that narratives crafted in the studio could influence the patience of fans and the decisions of owners. The power dynamic was changing quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it was changing all the same. It was during this era that I felt the first tug of recognition. The moment when I realized that the voices shaping the game had become more present in my memory than some of the players themselves. It was a strange realization, one that felt both natural and unsettling. The journalist was not part of the competition, yet they were central to how I understood it. They were the constant presence, the enduring guide across seasons and eras. What early television created was the foundation for the sports media landscape we know today. A landscape built on personalities, access, interpretation, and influence. It began with something as simple as a voice carried through the speaker, but expanded into something far more complex. These early journalists set in motion the evolution of the modern sports media machine, one that would eventually grow beyond their imagination. They established the blueprint for how stories would be told and how narratives would be shaped. They became the first architects of a new kind of power in sports, a power rooted not in athletic ability, but in the art of storytelling. As the decades moved forward, that power would grow in ways no one predicted. Television would become a global force. Networks would multiply. Opinions would become currency. Access would become leverage. Audiences would seek connection with the journalist as much as with the athlete. And slowly, inevitably, the journalist would move from the background of the broadcast to the foreground of the entire sports conversation. But it all began here. In the early days of television, the rise of those first recognizable voices. In the moment when describing the game became as important as playing it. That was the true birth of the modern sports media machine. A machine that would shape the next half-century of fandom, storytelling, influence, and power. There was a point in sports history when something subtle but unmistakable shifted. It happened slowly at first, almost quietly, as if no one wanted to admit it was occurring. But by the time the public realized what had changed, the transformation was already complete. The journalist had crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer just interpreters of the game. They were becoming stars in their own right. The shift began during the rise of national sports networks, when the same reporters appeared in every living room across the country week after week. Familiarity turned into recognition, and recognition turned into something stronger. Fans started repeating their phrases. Players started paying attention to their opinions. Owners began to worry about their headlines. It was the beginning of an era where a journalist's name carried as much weight as the logo on a team helmet. It felt strange at first, hearing people talk about journalists the way they once talked about athletes. You would walk into a bar on a Sunday morning and hear arguments not about the upcoming matchup, but about the latest take from a well-known insider. Their voices had become part of the emotional fabric of fandom. They were no longer simply reporting the news. They were shaping the temperature of every conversation surrounding it. This was the moment when the journalist became a brand. Some handled it with humility, keeping their focus on the responsibility they carried. Others leaned into it, understanding that visibility brought opportunity. Television rewarded confidence and rewarded personality. It was natural for journalists to elevate themselves because the industry around them encouraged it. The more compelling the persona, the more airtime they earned. And the more airtime they earned, the more powerful they became. Fame in journalism behaves differently than in athletics. Athletes are admired for physical feats. Journalists are admired for mastery of language, insight, and presence. What made this emerging fame so unusual was that it did not rely on performance in the traditional sense. It relied on perception. A journalist's influence became tied not to the accuracy of their reporting, but to the trust they inspired, the authority they projected, and the distinctiveness of their voice. As their platforms grew, so did the psychological complexity of their celebrity. Being a sports journalist suddenly meant navigating attention that could push them to the center of controversies they were merely covering. Their names became synonymous with certain stories. Their reputations became tied to the tone of their commentary. Fame created pressure to deliver not just information, but impact. It was here that the tension between reporting and self-branding began to surface. The journalist had always been a storyteller. someone who shaped the narrative by choosing what details mattered and what context deserved emphasis. But now, their own persona became part of that story. They had to balance objectivity with visibility, integrity with marketability. It was no longer enough to deliver facts. They had to deliver relevance, and relevance demanded a consistent presence, a recognizable viewpoint, a signature identity. This identity became its own force. Some journalists became associated with bold confrontational commentary. Others became known for their calm, analytical approach. Some built their image around access, cultivating relationships with insiders and executives. Others built careers on critique, embracing the role of the skeptic or the watchdog. The diversity of these personas strengthened the industry, but also blurred the line between journalism and entertainment. The first time I noticed the shift clearly was during a major off-season controversy. A star player was navigating contract negotiations, and every day, new updates filled the airwaves. What struck me was not the content of the updates, but the reaction to them. Fans were quoting journalists more passionately than the player himself. Not because the player lacked a voice, but because journalists had assumed the role of interpreters of the truth. Their words carried a sense of authority that overshadowed the athlete's own statements. This was the moment when journalists became more than messengers. They became characters in the story. And with that came a new form of power. A single segment on a morning debate show could shift public sentiment. A single tweet could alter the perception of a coach or influence the trajectory of a rumor. Journalists who had once worked in anonymity now found themselves navigating the strange territory of fame. Their influence extended beyond their reporting, shaping the emotional atmosphere of the sport. But fame carries complications. It attracts criticism as quickly as it attracts admiration. Journalists became targets for backlash. Their motives were questioned. Their relationships were scrutinized. Some thrived under this spotlight, embracing the responsibility of being public figures. Others struggled, realizing that being recognized brought unexpected pressures, including the pressure to maintain a persona even in moments when they wished to be neutral observers. The rise of the journalist as a star also changed the dynamic inside locker rooms. Athletes, once comfortable speaking freely, became wary. Coaches began filtering information more carefully. Front offices controlled access with greater precision. The presence of a journalist was no longer routine, it was strategic. Every interaction carried potential consequences because the journalist's voice could echo louder than ever before. This shift also created a new form of competition within journalism itself. Reporters were no longer simply competing for stories. They were competing for identity. The most recognizable journalists could shape entire news cycles. Networks promoted their work aggressively. Social media amplified their reach. Their words carried weight beyond the traditional boundaries of journalism, influencing debates, policies, and public opinion. As the industry evolved, the idea of journalistic celebrity became normalized. New voices entered the field with an expectation of visibility. Becoming a sports journalist no longer meant working in shadows behind the players. It meant stepping into a light that could illuminate or distort, depending on how one navigated it. The very idea of journalism had expanded to include personality, influence, and public recognition. Looking back, it becomes clear that this era marked a fundamental transformation. The emergence of star journalists redefined the power structure of sports media. It shifted the conversation from the performance on the field to the interpretation off it. It created a world in which journalists became trusted sources of truth, even as they grappled with the responsibilities that came with such trust. The tension between reporting and self-branding continues to shape the industry today. Journalists still walk the tightrope between delivering accurate information and maintaining a public identity that resonates with audiences. The rewards can be immense, but so can the risks. Fame can elevate a journalist to new heights, yet it can also overshadow the work they set out to do. This shift toward journalist celebrity changed not just how sports were covered, but how they were experienced. Fans connected with journalists as personalities, seeing them as voices that gave meaning to the chaos of the sports world. They trusted them to interpret not only events, but emotions. And in doing so, they elevated journalists to a status once reserved entirely for athletes and coaches. The rise of the journalist as a star did not happen overnight. It was the natural result of television expanding its reach and the audience seeking more than just the game. They wanted commentary. They wanted insight. They wanted connection. And journalists, with their presence and their voice, stepped into that role fully. This batch marks the beginning of an exploration into the complex relationships, power dynamics, and influences that grew from this transformation. It is a story about fame, responsibility, and the evolving identity of sports journalism. There was a moment in sports media when everything accelerated. It did not begin with a single headline or a single reporter. It began with a realization that information itself had become a form of power. The insider era arrived quietly and then erupted with a force that reshaped every corner of the sports world. It was no longer enough to analyze the game or tell the story of a season. The new currency was speed. The new battleground was access. And the new stars were the reporters who could reveal tomorrow's news before anyone else even knew something was happening. I remember watching this shift unfold from the inside. The first time I saw a journalist announce a blockbuster trade before the team involved had even contacted the player, I understood how much the landscape had changed. Years earlier, the process unfolded slowly. Beat writers gathered quotes. Newsrooms confirmed details. Editors reviewed statements. Stories appeared in print the following morning. There was patience in the rhythm. But once digital platforms took over, patience became a weakness. The only thing that mattered was who could hit send first. Breaking news became a form of warfare. Reporters competed not for context, but for speed. A single text message held the power to transform careers. Journalists built intricate webs of contacts, agents, executives, and scouts. Every connection mattered. Every conversation had potential. The race to be first blurred into a relentless chase that never seemed to end. I would watch insiders operate with a level of intensity that rivaled the athletes they covered. Phones on the table, phones in their hands. Phones buzzing with information from sources who trusted them or needed them, or sometimes simply used them. The insider became a conduit between private decisions and public reaction. What used to be hidden behind front office doors became a constant stream of updates, negotiations, and rumors. The fans loved it. The teams tolerated it. The insiders thrived in it. This era revealed how powerful information could be when delivered instantly. If a journalist broke news of a contract extension, the fan base reacted before the ink dried. If they announced a firing, the coach sometimes found out from social media instead of from ownership. If they hinted at tension inside a locker room, the speculation spread faster than any official statement could contain it. The insider did not simply report events, they shaped the emotions surrounding them. But the speed came with a cost. Accuracy became a fragile concept in a world where being first meant everything. Reporters faced pressure to trust sources who might have agendas. Agents leaked stories to strengthen their negotiating leverage. Executives leaked rumors to influence public perception. Players leaked information to gain control over their narratives. Every leak served a purpose, and insiders stood at the center of that shifting web of motivations. Being an insider meant navigating a world of private texts and quiet phone calls. I saw how reporters learned to read between the lines. A short message from an agent might signal a negotiation was breaking down. A sudden silence from a general manager might indicate a trade was in progress. The best insiders developed instincts that bordered on intuition. They could sense when something big was coming long before the confirmation reached them. Their relationships became as valuable as their reporting. But with great access came ethical pitfalls. The insider era blurred boundaries in ways that challenged the fundamentals of journalism. If a source requested preferential coverage in exchange for information, some reporters felt pressure to comply. The story involved a player who regularly provided updates. The journalist had to balance honesty with loyalty. There were moments when the truth was complicated, when every detail carried consequences, when insiders had to choose between breaking news and preserving trust. Those choices shaped their careers. Some insiders maintained strict discipline, refusing to compromise credibility even under intense pressure. Others leaned into the competitive nature of the job, accepting that the modern audience cared more about the headline than the ethical process behind it. This tension created a complicated environment where information flowed faster than ever, but the foundation supporting that flow grew more fragile. The insider era also changed how players viewed the media. In earlier decades, athletes interacted with reporters who focused on human stories and on-field performance. Now, players worried that a single private conversation could turn into public speculation. They monitored social media to see who said what about them. They learned that insiders often knew about trades and signings before they did. This dynamic created anxiety and distrust, even when journalists had no intention of causing harm. I recall a conversation with a veteran player who told me he found out he had been traded while scrolling through his phone in the parking lot. He had not received a call from his team yet. He learned the news from a reporter he had never met. He said it felt like the ground shifted beneath him, as if the game no longer belonged to those who played it. That moment defined the insider era more clearly than any headline could. The flow of information became faster than human communication. The audience embraced this speed. Fans wanted instant updates. They wanted inside details the moment they existed. They saw insiders not as journalists, but as gateways into the inner workings of their favorite teams. This demand fueled the cycle. Insiders became celebrities for the accuracy of their predictions, for their ability to reveal secrets, for their capacity to be everywhere at once. Their social media followings grew into millions. They developed reputations that felt larger than life. Yet behind the screens and the breaking news banners, the insiders carried a weight that was rarely acknowledged. The constant pressure to deliver, the need to maintain relationships without losing independence. The responsibility of sharing information that could affect careers, contracts, and reputations. The insider era demanded relentless vigilance, because missing one story meant losing momentum, and losing momentum meant losing relevance. As the world of sports evolved, the insider era became a defining force. It changed how fans consumed information. It changed how teams managed their strategies. It changed how athletes navigated their identities. It reshaped journalism into a field where access was everything. Speed was essential. And power rested with those who could transform a whisper into a headline within seconds. Information became power. Power became influence. And influence reshaped the entire ecosystem of sports media. The insider stood at the center of it all, balancing responsibility and ambition in a world that never paused long enough to let anyone catch their breath. The insider era was not just a chapter in the evolution of journalism. It was a turning point. It marked the moment when the line between news and impact nearly vanished. And it set the stage for even more complex dynamics that would follow as the industry continued to chase the next story, the next scoop, the next moment of attention. The first time I truly understood the cost of access, it was during a mid-season press conference. A young reporter asked a pointed question about a coach's questionable decision. The room fell silent. Eyes shifted. And I watched as veteran journalists adjusted their posture, reminded themselves of boundaries, and considered carefully what to say and what to withhold. Access is a subtle form of power. The ability to enter a locker room, attend a private meeting, or speak with an agent can shape a journalist's career as much as the quality of their writing. But proximity carries consequences. Every choice to preserve it comes with trade-offs. Access journalism is a world governed by relationships. To gain entry to the inner workings of a team, a reporter must earn trust. That trust is built over time and nurtured delicately. Coaches, executives, and players remember those who overstep boundaries. They quietly withdraw cooperation. They limit availability. Even a single misstep can close doors indefinitely. The journalist learns quickly that their words carry weight far beyond the printed page or broadcast segment. One ill-timed comment, one perceived betrayal of confidence can erase years of cultivated access. Franchises have long understood the strategic value of access. They realize that the journalist who is granted proximity becomes a conduit for shaping public perception. A carefully timed interview, a casual remark shared off the record, or a controlled quote can all be used to manage expectations, influence morale, or protect internal agendas. Teams often operate with calculated discretion, releasing details selectively to reporters who are perceived as reliable or aligned with organizational priorities. In this sense, journalists are both participants and observers, walking a fine line between autonomy and influence. I remember covering a team where the general manager meticulously managed access for an entire season. Some reporters received full press passes, one-on-one interviews, and exclusive scoops. Others were given only public statements or access at scheduled press conferences. The distinction was clear and deliberate. The journalist's proximity became a form of currency. It granted them the ability to report with authority, but it also subtly bound them to the organization's preferred narratives. Independence existed only within the confines of access. The ethical dilemmas of access journalism are complex. A reporter may know that a story could damage a relationship or upset the team hierarchy. They may also recognize that holding back information preserves the opportunity for future reporting. Decisions are rarely simple. The journalist must constantly weigh the benefits of disclosure against the risk of losing trust. Each choice carries potential consequences, not just for their career, but for the players and organizations involved. Sometimes silence can be as influential as a published story. Selective leaks are a powerful tool in this environment. Franchises carefully manage which journalists hear certain information, controlling the flow of narrative with precision. A leaked comment can shift public sentiment, pressure a contract negotiation, or redirect media focus from one issue to another. Insiders learn to interpret these signals, to read the patterns of disclosure, and to recognize when they are being strategically guided. The journalist becomes both a witness and a participant in a game they did not play on the field. The process is rarely transparent. A reporter may break a story and later discover it had been subtly steered by multiple sources within the organization. The perception of independence may exist, but the reality is a carefully constructed network of influence. Journalists understand that their access is contingent. They accept compromises as part of the trade-off for information that cannot be obtained elsewhere. Over time, these compromises can shape reporting, subtly influencing the framing, tone, and focus of stories. I recall speaking with a veteran journalist who described access as both a privilege and a burden. They explained that some reporters are willing to bend slightly to maintain proximity, while others maintain strict boundaries and risk losing opportunities. There is no universal approach. Each reporter negotiates this balance in a way that aligns with their ethics, ambition, and understanding of the sport. But the dynamic creates an inherent tension. The closer you are to the source, the more constrained your independence may become. Access journalism also influences the broader ecosystem of sports media. Stories that emerge from privileged relationships often dominate coverage, while alternative perspectives struggle for attention. Journalists outside the inner circle may find their work ignored or devalued. The very structure of reporting begins to favor those with connections, reinforcing hierarchies of influence. It is a system that rewards loyalty, discretion, and strategic alignment, sometimes at the expense of objectivity. The audience is rarely aware of these dynamics. Fans see headlines, quotes, and analysis, but seldom consider the behind-the-scenes negotiations that shaped the story. Yet those negotiations influence not just the content of coverage, but also the timing, emphasis, and interpretation of every narrative. Every revelation, every rumor, every breaking update is filtered through a network of relationships that operate largely out of sight. Access journalism turns proximity into power, and power into control over how the public understands the game. This world also creates subtle pressures on the journalist's judgment. Being close to players and coaches fosters empathy, but it also risks partiality. Emotional attachment can influence reporting choices. Long-standing relationships can make tough truths harder to communicate. And as the journalist becomes a trusted figure in the eyes of both sources and audience, their credibility rests on a careful balance of honesty, discretion, and self-restraint. It is a delicate equilibrium, one that requires constant awareness and professional discipline. I remember covering a season where the stakes of access became starkly clear. A controversial trade occurred mid-season, and the media was flooded with speculation. Those journalists with direct lines to front office officials were able to provide context and clarity. Others relied on fragmented information, rumors, and secondary sources. The disparity in reporting power was evident. Access determined the capacity to inform, shape public understanding, and establish authority. In that environment, proximity was not just an advantage. It was the defining factor in credibility. The ethical trade-offs are never fully resolved. Reporters can maintain independence but risk exclusion. They can cultivate access but risk complicity. They can choose objectivity at the expense of insight, or embrace influence at the expense of impartiality. Each choice has consequences, both immediate and long-term. The professional challenge is to navigate these tensions while still delivering accurate, meaningful reporting that serves the audience and preserves trust. By the end of the insider era and the rise of access journalism, the field had transformed entirely. The journalist was no longer simply an observer of events. They had become a participant in shaping them. Their proximity, their relationships, and their choices directly influenced how stories unfolded, how narratives were received, and how careers and reputations developed. Access created power, but it also demanded responsibility. And every journalist who navigated this world understood that the cost of proximity could be as high as the reward. This period solidified a new understanding of journalism in sports. Information was not merely a tool to inform. It was a lever to influence. The closeness of the reporter to their subject determined the weight of their voice. And the public, largely unaware of these dynamics, consumed the narratives without questioning the mechanisms behind them. Access journalism, in this sense, reshaped the entire ecosystem of coverage, establishing patterns that continue to define sports reporting today. In sports, as in life, memory is shaped as much by the teller as by the event itself. I first became aware of this when I noticed the way a story about a single game could outlast the game itself. A quarterback's improbable throw, a running back's decisive touchdown, a defensive stand in the final seconds, these moments existed in real time. But the way they were remembered was often determined by the journalist who chronicled them. Storytelling was no longer just an accessory to the action on the field. It had become central to the creation of legends. I recall listening to one broadcast from the 1980s, describing a rookie who had just broken into the league with a remarkable play. The reporter's voice was measured, reverent, and deliberate. Each phrase built suspense. Each observation framed the athlete as not just skilled, but fated. By the time the commentary concluded, the moment had been elevated into myth. The rookie was no longer just a player on a roster. He was a character in a story bigger than himself. A story that would echo in headlines, highlight reels, and fan conversations for years to come. That was when I first understood the latent power of narrative. It could transform ordinary performance into enduring legend. Journalists quickly recognized that their craft extended far beyond mere documentation. They had the ability to create context, to imbue significance, and to shape the public's perception of a career. A single article could frame a player's trajectory, painting a promising start as the prelude to greatness or a misstep as a harbinger of decline. With every sentence, every phrase, and every headline, reporters were not merely telling a story, they were crafting history as it would be remembered. The art of narrative lies in selection and emphasis. No season, no game, no play carries equal weight. The journalist decides which moments define a player, which performances encapsulate skill and character, and which patterns warrant attention. This power to curate and highlight has enormous implications. Careers can be elevated, reputations cemented, and achievements immortalized or overlooked entirely based on how the story is told. I remember a conversation with a Hall of Fame running back who reflected on his career and the media coverage he received. He told me that certain journalists had made him feel larger than life during moments when he barely understood his own significance. Conversely, he noted that a few critical articles early in his career had planted seeds of doubt in the public mind that took years to dispel. He admitted that the narrative often felt as important as the performance itself, if not more so. In that revelation, I recognized the dual nature of storytelling. It could elevate, but it could also confine, define, or even distort reality. Crafting legend is not merely about praise or acclaim. It is about creating resonance. Reporters learned to highlight qualities that aligned with larger cultural narratives: perseverance, grit, leadership, artistry, and resilience. They understood that audiences craved heroes who exemplified ideals and emotions beyond technical skill. A player's significance was measured not only in statistics, but in the mythos constructed by those chronicling their journey. In the early decades, this process was organic, grounded in observation and instinct. A journalist would note the nuances of performance, the demeanor in the locker room, the moments that revealed character under pressure. As the industry evolved, narrative construction became more deliberate. Editors recognized the appeal of building stars. Networks amplified the stories, and journalists began to consider the long-term resonance of their coverage. Legendary performances became canonized through repetition, reflection, and framing. The psychology behind it is compelling. Fans do not simply remember facts. They remember stories. They recall drama, struggle, triumph, and emotion. They attach themselves to personas built as much by narrative as by performance. Athletes are human, but the story elevates them to archetypes. Journalists provide the scaffolding for this elevation. A single well-told article or broadcast can fix an image of an athlete that persists long after they retire. That is the essence of myth-making, shaping memory through careful articulation. Some narratives are reinforced by continuity. A journalist following a player from rookie season to retirement has the opportunity to craft an evolving story, one that emphasizes growth, challenges, and legacy. Repetition across seasons, columns, and broadcasts strengthens the legend. Fans internalize the narrative, and it becomes the lens through which every new performance is judged. Journalists, whether intentionally or not, wield the power to codify reputation. The creation of legend is not immune to controversy. Rivalries, injuries, missteps, and scandals are reframed, contextualized, or sometimes magnified to support the overarching narrative. The line between reality and perception blurs. A player's reputation may hinge on how journalists frame adversity or success. Stories that celebrate triumph or critique failure carry weight beyond the immediate context, influencing endorsement opportunities, Hall of Fame consideration, and historical memory. I once spoke with a player whose career was defined by a single controversial play. The media coverage that followed was relentless. Some reports emphasized his heroism, others his miscalculation. Over time, the commentary solidified into a shared narrative among fans and pundits alike. Even years later, when reviewing statistics or watching footage, the legend persisted because the narrative had created a lens through which the performance was interpreted. The story had become inseparable from the athlete. This process of constructing myth is inherently selective. Some athletes are celebrated disproportionately because journalists find their stories compelling, culturally resonant, or narratively satisfying. Others, equally skilled, may receive less attention because they do not fit the preferred archetype or lack visibility in media hubs. Narrative power is unevenly distributed, and the consequences are significant. Access, timing, and editorial priorities all influence which legends endure and which fade. Storytelling also intersects with culture. Journalists craft narratives that align with societal values, prevailing ideals, and collective imagination. Heroism, redemption, underdog triumph, and perseverance are thematic threads that resonate across decades. The legend of an athlete becomes both a personal achievement and a symbol of broader ideals. This amplification elevates journalism from mere reporting to a form of cultural authorship. By shaping legacy, journalists exert influence that extends far beyond the immediate scope of their reporting. They determine not only what fans remember, but also how future generations understand the history of sport. A single article, profile, or broadcast commentary can ripple through time, reinforcing reputations and preserving memory. Athletes are remembered as much for the stories told about them as for the statistics on the scoreboard. In observing this phenomenon, I recognize the dual role of journalism in both illuminating reality and shaping myth. The power to create legends is a responsibility as much as it is a privilege. A story told with insight and balance can preserve truth while amplifying greatness. A story told recklessly or without context can misrepresent, diminish, or exaggerate. The weight of narrative is considerable, and few understand its implications as clearly as the journalists entrusted with its construction. The modern media landscape only amplifies this effect. With constant coverage, digital archives, and instant replay, narratives are reinforced repeatedly. Social media accelerates the dissemination. Commentary adds layers, and fan discourse solidifies impressions. Legends are built not solely by performance, but by the persistent echo of the story surrounding that performance. Journalism, in this sense, has become a co-author of history. The lesson is clear. Athletes may win games, but journalists win immortality. Through careful observation, deliberate framing, and the subtle art of storytelling, reporters create the mythos of sport. They shape perception, influence reputation, and guide collective memory. Legends exist not only in the moments played, but in the narratives that endure. And for those of us who witness it unfold, the realization is both awe-inspiring and humbling. The power to define greatness often rests in the hands of the storyteller. For every legend a journalist creates, there is another story that casts a long shadow. I first realized the destructive power of narrative when I witnessed a career unravel, not because of performance on the field, but because of the lens through which it was reported. A single misstep, a poorly framed story, or a misinterpreted quote can define an athlete for years, sometimes permanently. Journalists, whether intentionally or inadvertently, wield a power that can shape public perception and, in doing so, alter the trajectory of lives and careers. Consider the quarterback whose missed throw became the subject of relentless scrutiny. The play itself was not extraordinary, but the reporting surrounding it amplified every mistake, every hesitation into evidence of decline. Headlines framed his leadership as fragile. Analysts speculated on his mental toughness, and fans absorbed the narrative as truth. The media's framing overshadowed his accomplishments, and for years, he was remembered less for victories than for that singular moment of perceived failure. This was not a reflection of his skill, but of the narrative constructed around him. Journalists operate with an inherent tension, the need to report accurately, balanced against the drive to capture attention. Misreporting can occur through haste, misunderstanding, or selective framing. The consequences, however, are rarely contained. Players are not only judged in the moment, they are judged for years based on how their actions are described. A poorly phrased article or a misattributed quote can ripple across broadcasts, social media, and fan forums, solidifying an interpretation that becomes difficult to reverse. I recall the case of a young athlete accused of poor sportsmanship after a game. Initial reports emphasized aggression and questioned character without full context. The narrative quickly dominated discussions, and sponsors reconsidered endorsements. Coaches were asked to comment on behavior already presumed guilty. Even when subsequent reports clarified the circumstances, the initial framing had already cemented a public perception. Careers in sport, I realized, can hinge as much on the first story told as on actual performance. Ethics and accountability are central to this dynamic. Journalists who frame stories carelessly or sensationalize events contribute to an environment where perception outweighs reality. Misinterpretation can occur unintentionally through misunderstanding, incomplete sources, or a desire for impact, but the consequences are tangible. Players may lose endorsements, be traded, or face skepticism from fans and management alike. The fragility of reputation in the public eye is immense, and journalists are often the architects of that fragility. Another striking example comes from misreported off-field incidents. A few words misquoted, an unverified rumor published prematurely, and suddenly an athlete is defined by controversy rather than performance. In some cases, these narratives overshadow years of accomplishments. I spoke with a veteran player who had endured months of criticism due to a mischaracterized comment. He described feeling powerless, as though every effort on the field was nullified by stories he could not control. His experience underscored the profound responsibility journalists carry in shaping reputations. The psychological toll on athletes is profound. A career is built on discipline, performance, and resilience. Yet when public perception is dominated by narrative rather than fact, it introduces stress, doubt, and distraction. Players must navigate not only competition on the field, but also judgment off it, often mediated by the words of journalists they cannot control. The media, in this sense, becomes a parallel arena, where careers are contested through framing and emphasis rather than through athletic skill. Framing is a subtle form of influence. Choosing which events to highlight, which sources to quote, and which language to employ can create lasting impressions. Consider how a journalist's description of a locker room disagreement might depict conflict or camaraderie, depending on the words chosen. The narrative can suggest dysfunction or unity. The implication for public perception is significant, and athletes are acutely aware that narrative, once established, is difficult to dislodge. Some journalists embrace this power consciously, aware that their coverage can build intrigue, sell stories, and attract viewers. Others underestimate its impact, viewing reporting as a neutral relay of events. Yet the result is the same. Perception is shaped, and perception carries consequences. When careers are derailed by narrative, it illustrates the weight of responsibility inherent in the journalist's role. Accuracy is essential, but so too is the understanding that language frames reality for audiences. I remember a case in which a veteran player was accused of favoritism by a journalist's analysis of play calling patterns. The coverage implied that the athlete received undue advantage, questioning integrity and fairness. The report gained traction. Fans debated the implication, and team executives privately acknowledged concern. Despite the statistical record showing no evidence of bias, the narrative persisted. Years later, the player admitted that the media scrutiny affected relationships with teammates and opportunities within the league. It was a clear example of how framing could impose real-world consequences independent of factual performance. The destructive power of narrative is amplified in high-profile controversies. Media coverage shapes public discourse in ways that statistics and official statements cannot. When journalists report with partial information, speculative language, or unverified claims, they create a perception that may persist regardless of eventual clarification. Athletes' reputations, in effect, become a function of narrative momentum. Once a story gains traction, it often eclipses subsequent corrections or context. Social media intensifies this phenomenon. A single story can spread rapidly, magnified by discussion, sharing, and commentary. Fans internalize narratives, repeating interpretations that become self-reinforcing. The journalist's framing acts as a catalyst, but the amplification comes from the audience itself. Careers can be reshaped not by actions on the field, but by the velocity of perception once a narrative is released into the public sphere. Long-term fallout is not limited to individual athletes. Teams, coaches, and organizations are affected as well. Management decisions may be influenced by media scrutiny, hiring or firing choices shaped by public perception, and strategic decisions reframed under the lens of controversy. The journalist's narrative becomes a force multiplier, influencing decisions far beyond immediate reporting. In reflecting on this reality, I recognize the dual nature of journalism. It has the capacity to elevate and to destroy. The same craft that builds legends can also erode them. The weight of this power is enormous. Every word, every headline, every framing choice contributes to a perception that may outlast the athlete, the game, and even the season. Careers are fragile, and narratives can be unforgiving. The insider era and the rise of access journalism amplified these risks. The journalist who is closest to the story often shapes it most dramatically. Proximity provides insight, but it also magnifies the consequences of missteps. A single misjudged comment in a private conversation, when reported, can trigger a cascade of public interpretation, turning minor disputes into major controversies. As I reflect on the impact of destructive narratives, it is impossible to ignore the human dimension. Athletes are more than statistics and plays. They are people whose lives, identities, and professional opportunities are influenced by how stories are told. Journalists, as the intermediaries between events and public perception, bear a responsibility that is both ethical and professional. Narrative power is inherent in the craft, but its consequences are deeply human. Ultimately, the lesson of this era is stark. Storytelling is never neutral. The framing of events, the choice of language, and the emphasis placed on particular moments can create myths or impose shadows. Careers, reputations, and legacies exist in the interplay between performance and narrative. Journalists are the architects of this balance, and with that role comes both influence and responsibility. The rise of the journalist as a celebrity did not occur in a vacuum. Behind every byline and broadcast segment lies an intricate web of economic forces that shaped the profession, created incentives for personal branding, and transformed reporting from a craft into a business. I first began to understand this when I observed the growing divergence between reporters who relied solely on newsroom salaries and those whose value extended far beyond traditional compensation. Money, visibility, and influence became intertwined, and the pursuit of personal brand became a strategic component of career advancement. In the early days of televised sports, salaries were modest, and journalists primarily reported for the sake of informing an audience. Their credibility, their access, and their analytical skills determined influence more than earnings or celebrity. But as networks recognized the power of personalities to attract viewers, a new dynamic emerged. Reporters who could draw attention were rewarded not only with higher salaries, but also with opportunities for on-air commentary, book deals, speaking engagements, and later, digital platforms with independent reach. Being a credible voice was no longer enough. Visibility became a form of currency. The concept of network leverage became central to this era. Networks recognized that viewers gravitated toward familiar voices. A journalist with a loyal following could secure larger contracts and better exposure. Ratings, subscriptions, and advertising revenue were tied directly to personality as much as to reporting skill. The economic incentives created a feedback loop. The more attention a journalist garnered, the more opportunities they received, which in turn expanded their influence and earning potential. The business model of media itself began to shape individual careers. Sponsorships and brand partnerships further amplified the economic dimension. Journalists could leverage their credibility and audience reach to collaborate with corporate entities, endorsing products, engaging in promotions, or developing personal ventures. Some reporters became not just narrators of the game, but entrepreneurs in their own right, building networks of influence that intersected with commerce. The line between reporting and brand building blurred, and those who understood the mechanics of fame could translate visibility into financial gain. I recall speaking with a journalist who had transitioned from traditional reporting to a multi-platform persona, combining television segments, podcasts, and social media presence. Their salary alone would have been significant, but sponsorships and brand partnerships multiplied earnings exponentially. They explained that maintaining relevance was a constant effort. Timely commentary, strategic appearances, and audience engagement were essential. Fame became both a professional asset and a form of labor, demanding continuous investment. The economics of celebrity journalism also influenced editorial priorities. Stories that attracted attention, generated clicks, or sparked discussion were more valuable in an economic sense than quiet, nuanced analysis. The pressures of the business incentivized coverage that highlighted drama, conflict, or controversy. As a result, the market often rewarded journalists who could capture and amplify moments that elicited strong audience reactions. While quality and accuracy remained central to credibility, visibility increasingly dictated opportunity and compensation. Networks themselves adapted to this shift. Instead of simply providing platforms for reporting, they curated personalities as marketable entities. A journalist's brand became a product that could be promoted across shows, social media, and merchandising. Ratings-driven programming prioritized analysts and reporters whose names carried weight. The network's financial calculus intertwined directly with the cultivation of individual celebrity, creating a mutually reinforcing system where economic incentives shaped professional behavior. The business of sports journalism also introduced disparities within the field. Those with strong access, distinctive voices, or early visibility could command lucrative contracts, while equally skilled journalists without platform or exposure often remained undercompensated. Economic incentives favored those who could cultivate attention and navigate the intersections of reporting, branding, and influence. Access alone was not sufficient. The ability to translate it into marketable visibility became critical. Digital platforms further amplified the economic stakes. Social media allowed journalists to cultivate independent audiences, sometimes rivaling the reach of the networks that employed them. Podcasts, subscription services, and personal content channels created new revenue streams and new leverage. Journalists could build personal brands that existed beyond traditional media structures, negotiating contracts from positions of increased autonomy and financial advantage. Fame, influence, and compensation were no longer confined to traditional reporting roles. But with these opportunities came pressures. Journalists faced expectations to maintain constant visibility, to generate content that satisfied both audience demand and economic imperatives. The pursuit of brand and attention could conflict with journalistic rigor. Reporting became intertwined with self-promotion, and the business incentives sometimes encouraged storytelling that favored spectacle over substance. Career success depended not only on the quality of analysis, but also on the ability to capture and maintain audience attention. Salaries and sponsorships also reinforced hierarchies within the profession. Those who navigated the economics of celebrity journalism effectively gained access to the most prestigious platforms, the most influential sources, and the largest audiences. Their visibility created a self-reinforcing loop. Fame led to opportunity. Opportunity led to audience growth, and audience growth further enhanced fame. Journalists who struggled to break into this cycle found themselves constrained, regardless of skill or insight. Economic power thus became a defining feature of influence within sports media. The incentives extended beyond individual reporters to entire networks and organizations. Corporate media entities understood that personalities drove consumption. high-profile journalists became anchors for programming, marketing, and cross-platform promotion. The economic engine rewarded those who could maintain relevance and deliver ratings, incentivizing brand cultivation alongside traditional reporting. Media economics shaped not only the profession, but also the content itself, as attention and revenue increasingly guided editorial decisions. I recall a discussion with an industry executive who explained the calculus plainly. Audiences respond to personalities more than process. A compelling voice, a consistent presence, and a strong brand could generate measurable revenue. Networks measured value not only in viewers, but in engagement, clicks, and subscription retention. Journalists who could command this attention were essential components of the business, and their economic worth often exceeded that of individual reporting tasks. Fame became a function of both talent and marketability. The monetization of celebrity journalism created both opportunity and risk. Success could yield remarkable compensation, widespread recognition, and influence. Failure to maintain visibility, missteps in judgment, or public controversy could erode brand value quickly, impacting income and reputation. The economics of fame were volatile, intertwined with the dynamics of audience perception, network strategy, and competitive positioning. Navigating this landscape required both strategic foresight and an understanding of the business imperatives that shape the profession. Ultimately, the economic dimension of journalist celebrity transformed the profession fundamentally. Reporting was no longer solely about conveying facts or analyzing performance. It was a complex interplay of visibility, influence, and financial strategy. Journalists who understood the market forces could leverage their craft into a platform of power and compensation. Those who did not were often relegated to the margins. Fame and financial opportunity became inseparable. And the economics of the field created a new hierarchy in sports media. One defined as much by brand and visibility as by skill or insight. This shift, as I came to realize, illuminated the stakes of every story. The incentives behind each decision, and the pressures journalists faced in balancing integrity with opportunity. Celebrity journalism was not merely a cultural phenomenon. It was an economic reality that shaped who spoke, who listened, and whose voices endured. In this landscape, the business of fame became inseparable from the craft of reporting, and the rewards and the risks were profound. There was a point when sports journalism was defined by reporting, by clarity, by the measured relay of events. That era gradually shifted. And I remember noticing it first in the way televised debate shows began to dominate weekend programming. Journalists no longer merely reported scores, stats, and schedules. They became performers, commentators, analysts, and, increasingly, entertainers. The rise of opinion as entertainment transformed the field, creating new opportunities, new pressures, and a new understanding of the journalist's role. I recall watching a primetime sports debate where the discussion was less about facts and more about provocation. Panelists were expected to argue, challenge, and react in ways that captured attention. The journalist's credibility, once grounded in accuracy and insight, became entangled with charisma, timing, and emotional resonance. Success was measured by engagement, by the intensity of the audience reaction, by clicks, shares, and the viral spread of opinions. Reporting had become a performance, and the stage was the nation's living rooms. The mechanics of this shift were subtle, but powerful. Networks realized that viewers craved drama, conflict, and perspective, not merely recitation of facts. Opinion-driven shows provided both information and entertainment, and journalists learned to adapt. They honed skills that were once secondary: delivery, timing, personality, because the medium rewarded engagement over detachment. Ratings and audience loyalty were directly linked to the ability to perform under the spotlight. A sharp insight alone was insufficient. It had to be delivered with impact. This evolution created a paradox. Journalists were both analysts and actors. They needed access to inside information to maintain credibility while simultaneously cultivating a persona that resonated with audiences. The tension between the objective pursuit of truth and the necessity of performance was constant. One could be admired for insight, but vilified if the persona failed to captivate. Emotional intensity became a currency, and the personal cost of maintaining that intensity was often invisible to the audience. The emotional toll on journalists was significant. The expectation to perform, day in and day out, introduced fatigue, stress, and pressure that had little precedent in traditional reporting. Live debates, social media engagement, and the demand for instant reactions created an environment where the journalist was always on stage, never allowed a pause. I spoke with a seasoned reporter who described the experience as living under a spotlight you cannot step away from. Every statement, every facial expression, every reaction was evaluated, critiqued, and amplified. Mistakes were public and immediate. Successes transient, unless repeated. This performative aspect also affected the way stories were covered. The pressure to provide commentary in real time to deliver opinion quickly often preceded thorough investigation. Rapid analysis sometimes replaced deliberate reporting. Journalists were expected to offer insights based on incomplete information, knowing that hesitation could cost relevance and visibility. The performance economy dictated not only how stories were delivered, but how they were created, shaping the speed, tone, and selection of coverage. Debate shows and opinion-driven segments amplified personalities, turning journalists into celebrities in their own right. Their voices became part of the spectacle, and audiences grew attached to viewpoints as much as they did to athletes or teams. Fans would tweet, discuss, and even defend journalists as if they were participants in the game. The journalist was no longer an impartial observer, but an influential actor, shaping perceptions and expectations. Audience engagement became a measure of success, and the pressure to maintain relevance intensified with every broadcast. The evolution of journalism into entertainment had consequences for credibility and trust. Opinion-driven coverage sometimes blurred the line between analysis and assertion, between insight and provocation. A statement intended to generate discussion could be interpreted as fact, and interpretations could spread rapidly across social platforms. Journalists were expected to navigate this landscape, balancing performance with integrity, insight with provocation, and influence with accountability. The margin for error was narrow, and the stakes were personal as well as professional. I remember a particular instance where a journalist's provocative comment sparked a national conversation. Fans dissected every word, pundits weighed in, and social media amplified the impact. The statement was taken out of context in some cases, yet it became a defining moment in the journalist's public persona. The incident highlighted the dual-edged nature of this form of reporting. The same platform that could elevate reputation could also introduce lasting scrutiny and, at times, unintended consequences. The shift toward performance-driven journalism also shaped the culture within newsrooms. Producers sought panelists who could hold attention. Editors favored stories that generated discussion. And networks rewarded journalists who could navigate the dual demands of insight and entertainment. The traditional hierarchy, which once emphasized reporting skill above all, is now considered personality, adaptability, and audience resonance as critical metrics of success. The profession's evolution was as much cultural as structural, transforming norms, expectations, and the very definition of journalistic accomplishment. Another dimension of the rise of opinion as entertainment was the acceleration of feedback loops. Social media allowed audiences to respond instantly to commentary, to correct, challenge, or celebrate analysis in real time. Journalists became participants in ongoing discourse that was simultaneously public, relentless, and immediate. Emotional energy, once reserved for reporting and analysis, was now expended managing perception, reacting to critique, and sustaining visibility. The performance never ended, and the personal cost was substantial. This transformation was not universal. Some journalists resisted the shift, maintaining traditional reporting standards, emphasizing accuracy over spectacle, and prioritizing investigation over immediate reaction. Their work retained credibility, but often struggled for attention in an environment increasingly dominated by personality and debate. Others embraced the change, recognizing that influence and opportunity were intertwined with performance. The divergence highlighted the economic, cultural, and psychological dimensions of the profession, demonstrating that success now depended on a complex combination of skill, personality, and resilience. By the end of the first decade of opinion-driven sports media, the journalist was as much an entertainer as a reporter. Their role expanded to include persuasion, provocation, and performance. Audiences were drawn to insight, yes, but also to emotional resonance, spectacle, and personality. The boundaries between information, commentary, and entertainment blurred, and the expectation of constant engagement transformed the profession in ways that were both exciting and exhausting. I came to understand that this evolution reflected deeper changes in culture and technology. Audiences craved immediacy, emotional intensity, and discussion. Networks and digital platforms recognized the economic potential of personality-driven content. Journalists became central to this ecosystem, navigating a landscape in which influence, engagement, and credibility were inseparable from performance. Opinion was no longer supplemental, it had become essential to the structure of sports media. And yet, the human cost was real. Behind the confident statements and quick-witted exchanges were reporters managing stress, fatigue, and the relentless expectation to perform. Maintaining authenticity while performing under pressure became a defining challenge. In this environment, insight, analysis, and accuracy remained critical. But they were inseparable from the labor of being a constant presence, a consistent voice, and an engaging performer. Ultimately, the rise of opinion as entertainment reshaped the profession, the audience, and the relationship between journalist and fan. It created new opportunities for influence and revenue, but introduced profound personal and professional pressures. The journalist became a performer, their words as much a product as a report, their presence as critical as their analysis. This evolution redefined the field and established patterns that continue to influence sports media today. The advent of social media transformed sports journalism in ways that were both exhilarating and perilous. I first noticed the shift during a season when Twitter became the primary venue for breaking news, debate, and speculation. Journalists were no longer confined to print deadlines, scheduled broadcasts, or editorial calendars. With a single post, a reporter could reach millions instantly, shaping narratives, influencing perceptions, and sometimes rewriting history in real time. The power of amplification was unprecedented, and with it came both opportunity and responsibility. Social media turned journalists into influencers. Followers counted, likes mattered, and retweets amplified impact. The lines between personal voice and professional reporting blurred. A reporter could comment on a trade, share an opinion on a controversial call, or highlight a player's off-field activity, and the response would be immediate, massive, and emotionally charged. Suddenly, journalists were not just conveyors of news, they were participants in a conversation with audiences that had previously been passive. Engagement became a currency, and influence was measured in metrics that had little to do with the traditional evaluation of reporting skill. Instant feedback loops transformed behavior. Every post, every tweet, every comment was subject to scrutiny from fans, peers, athletes, and executives. Praise, criticism, and viral reaction arrived within moments. Journalists learned to adapt quickly, refining their voice, tone, and timing to maintain relevance and credibility. The pressure to respond, to clarify, or to react became constant. A single misstep could trigger widespread debate, a storm of criticism, or unintended consequences. Social media introduced a relentless pace that reshaped how journalists approach their work. I recall a journalist whose scoop about a high-profile trade became a trending topic overnight. The story itself was accurate, verified, and timely. Yet the journalists found themselves inundated with messages, questions, and second-guessing from fans and colleagues alike. Every detail was analyzed, debated, and dissected in real time. The emotional labor of this engagement was enormous. Instant feedback created a new dimension of accountability, one that existed beyond traditional editorial oversight. The audience itself became a judge, jury, and amplifier of every professional action. The influence of social media also altered relationships within the industry. Sources, athletes, and agents recognized the platform's power. Journalists with large followings were treated differently, offered privileged access, and sometimes courted for strategic advantage. The velocity of news dissemination created an environment in which influence was concentrated, in the hands of those who could reach audiences most efficiently. Traditional hierarchies of journalism shifted. Authority became a function of reach as much as insight, and social media amplified that dynamic. Social media magnified both opportunity and risk. A breaking story could cement reputation, elevate a journalist's brand, or attract new opportunities. Conversely, a poorly worded post, a misinterpreted comment, or a premature report could spread like wildfire, creating lasting reputational damage. The stakes were immediate and public. Journalists had to navigate a terrain where errors were amplified. Praise was fleeting, and influence was fragile. The platform democratized voice, but intensified consequences. The behavioral impact was evident in coverage patterns. Journalists learned to post quickly, anticipate viral reactions, and craft messages designed to maximize engagement. Timing, phrasing, and emotional resonance became as important as the underlying facts. The dynamic created incentives to prioritize speed over depth, to emphasize controversy over nuance, and to frame narratives in ways that captured attention instantly. Social media rewarded immediacy, and the pressure to remain visible and relevant reshaped reporting habits. I observed athletes adapt as well. Players began interacting with journalists directly, responding to posts and shaping narratives themselves. The interplay between journalists and athletes became increasingly complex, with social media functioning as both a bridge and a battleground. Journalists were no longer intermediaries alone. They were participants in a network of influence where feedback, correction, and amplification were constant. Reputation, access, and authority were mediated not only by expertise, but also by digital presence. The psychological toll on journalists was substantial. The constant visibility, the unrelenting pace, and the immediacy of response created stress, fatigue, and heightened self-awareness. Every post required calculation, awareness of audience interpretation, and anticipation of consequences. Emotional labor became inseparable from professional responsibility. The public sphere was no longer passive. It was reactive, judgmental, and amplified, creating pressures that extended far beyond traditional deadlines. Yet social media also provided unparalleled opportunity for engagement. Journalists could build direct relationships with fans, cultivate personal brands, and shape discourse in real time. Platforms allowed them to demonstrate expertise, provide analysis, and correct misinformation instantly. The influence wielded was immediate and measurable, allowing journalists to translate credibility and reach into career growth, visibility, and professional leverage. Social media became both a tool and a stage, redefining what it meant to be a journalist in the modern era. The amplification effect extended to narratives themselves. Rumors, speculation, and opinion could gain traction with astonishing speed. Journalists became both reporters and participants in viral cycles, sometimes controlling the narrative, sometimes reacting to it. The velocity of information flow meant that a single post could frame public perception, shape debates, and influence decision-making within organizations. The traditional gatekeeping role of journalism was transformed by the immediacy and reach of digital amplification. Social media also reshaped ethical considerations. The boundary between reporting and commentary became blurred, and the temptation to post for engagement rather than accuracy created a complex landscape. Journalists had to balance professional integrity with platform dynamics, knowing that every interaction could be scrutinized, misinterpreted, or weaponized. The amplification of influence intensified both opportunity and responsibility. Ultimately, social media redefined the journalist-audience relationship. Audiences were no longer passive consumers, but active participants in the flow of information. Journalists had to navigate expectations, manage feedback, and maintain credibility while performing in a public, instantaneous, and highly visible environment. Influence was amplified, engagement was constant, and the stakes were immediate and persistent. I came to understand that the great amplifier of social media did not simply increase reach, it altered behavior, reshaped reporting practices, and elevated the personal and professional consequences of every word. Journalists were now influencers, their authority intertwined with visibility, their credibility reinforced or challenged with every post, and their role defined by both information and performance. The platform transformed the profession, embedding opportunity, risk, and influence into a single, relentless ecosystem. Social media, in effect, became both a microscope and a megaphone. It magnified insight, mistakes, and personality. It rewarded visibility, engagement, and adaptability. It amplified narratives, accelerated consequences, and intensified scrutiny. Journalists had to learn quickly that the audience was omnipresent, opinion was immediate, and influence was both fragile and immense. Careers, reputations, and legacies could now be shaped in real time by a single post, a single retweet, a single viral moment. In this landscape, the journalist's role evolved once more. They were not only chroniclers of sport, but also participants in an accelerated, amplified ecosystem of influence. Reporting, analysis, commentary, and personal branding became inseparable. The boundaries between professional and personal, between insight and performance, between fact and interpretation were constantly negotiated. Social media had made journalists powerful and vulnerable simultaneously, reshaping the profession in ways that continue to reverberate across the industry. The rise of the journalist as celebrity brought enormous influence, unprecedented visibility, and financial opportunity, but it also introduced a perilous vulnerability. I first observed the dark side of fame when a colleague I had admired for years found themselves embroiled in a scandal that threatened not only their career, but the very credibility they had spent decades building. Celebrity journalists are under constant scrutiny, and their mistakes are amplified by the platforms that once elevated them. When fame implodes, the consequences are swift, public, and often brutal. Scandals among high-profile journalists are rarely isolated events. They exist at the intersection of access, ambition, and visibility. One misstep, a poorly considered statement, or an ethical lapse can ignite a chain reaction of criticism, social media uproar, and professional consequence. I witnessed a case in which a reporter published an unverified story during a breaking news cycle, believing the urgency of timing justified the risk. The story was later discredited, yet by that point, the damage to their reputation was irreversible. Public trust, once fractured, is difficult to restore, and the network's response was swift and unforgiving. Suspensions became both a tool of accountability and a spectacle in their own right. Networks, under pressure from audiences, advertisers, and internal oversight, frequently take decisive action to protect credibility. A suspension is not merely punitive, it is performative, signaling to the public that standards remain intact. For the journalist, however, it is a public fall from grace, a moment when career, reputation, and personal identity are subjected to intense scrutiny. The emotional and psychological toll is profound. One journalist I interviewed described the period of suspension as a forced isolation, a time when the audience's judgment felt omnipresent, even when I was alone. The public backlash that accompanies scandal is relentless. Social media accelerates the spread of criticism, amplifying every misstep, real or perceived. Fans, colleagues, and competitors contribute to a chorus of opinion that is immediate, pervasive, and often unforgiving. For celebrity journalists, there is no private space to absorb mistakes. Their fall is broadcast, dissected, and debated at every level. The velocity of judgment is extraordinary, and the consequences extend far beyond temporary absence from air or print. Influence, access, and credibility can all be eroded within hours. Ethics and accountability are central to these dynamics. The very qualities that create celebrity visibility, immediacy, and influence so increase the stakes of error. Ethical lapses, conflicts of interest, or even the perception of impropriety are magnified when journalists operate in the public eye. Audience trust is fragile, and networks are acutely aware that one lapse can taint brand perception, advertiser relationships, and viewer loyalty. For the journalist, the balance between opportunity and responsibility is delicate, and the consequences of misjudgment are often severe. Redemption arcs, when they occur, are complex. A journalist's path to recovery requires transparency, contrition, and sustained demonstration of professionalism. Public memory, however, is selective. While some journalists manage to rehabilitate their careers, returning to influence and visibility, others remain defined by the scandal that interrupted their trajectory. The dynamics of fame, reputation, and accountability create an ecosystem in which every action is scrutinized, and recovery is never guaranteed. I recall one journalist who successfully returned after a suspension, carefully reconstructing credibility through measured reporting, accountability, and consistent performance. Their journey underscored the reality that redemption is a labor-intensive process, requiring both humility and strategic engagement. The consequences of scandal extend beyond the individual. Networks face reputational risk. Colleagues experience collateral scrutiny, and audiences reevaluate trust in the institution as a whole. Sports organizations may reconsider relationships with journalists. Access may be restricted, and future opportunities for reporting can be diminished. The ripple effect is far-reaching, revealing how the prominence of a single journalist intertwines with broader professional ecosystems. Fame, it turns out, carries both privilege and exposure, and the costs of error are collective as well as personal. I recall a particularly high-profile case in which a journalist's personal behavior, unrelated to reporting, became the center of public controversy. The audience response was immediate, critical, and amplified by social media. The network moved swiftly to suspend the journalist while internal reviews were conducted. The fallout was extensive. Colleagues were questioned, advertisers reconsidered partnerships, and the journalist's previously unassailable reputation was fractured. Their eventual return required months of public explanation, engagement, and measured reporting. The experience highlighted the fragility of celebrity in journalism and the constant vigilance required to maintain credibility. The phenomenon of scandals and suspensions illustrates a critical tension in modern sports media. Influence and visibility come at a cost. The journalist's platform is both a source of power and a vector for vulnerability. One misstep, one lapse in judgment, and the reach that once elevated a career can accelerate its undoing. Fame intensifies scrutiny, amplifies mistakes, and creates stakes that were largely absent in earlier eras of reporting. The audience, the network, and the platform itself all contribute to the magnitude of consequence. This dynamic is compounded by the speed of modern media. In the past, errors could be corrected in print editions or during scheduled broadcasts, with time for reflection and measured response. Today, a misstatement spreads instantly across social networks, replayed, dissected, and debated in real time. Journalists operate in a landscape of immediate consequence, where rapid response is required. Yet, misjudgment can compound the damage. The dark side of celebrity is not theoretical. It is lived and experienced, often publicly, with tangible repercussions. Journalist scandals also reveal the interplay between personal and professional identity. Celebrity journalists are public figures. Their behavior, both on and off the job, is scrutinized. Ethical lapses, personal controversies, or misjudged statements are interpreted as reflective of professional integrity. The conflation of personal and professional identity magnifies consequences, and the path to restoration requires careful management of both spheres. The pressure to maintain consistency, authenticity, and credibility is relentless, with little room for error. Ultimately, the dark side of celebrity journalism is inseparable from the forces that create it. Visibility, influence, and economic opportunity generate enormous potential, but also introduce profound vulnerability. Scandals, suspensions, and public backlash are the natural consequences of a system that rewards attention, engagement, and personality. Journalists navigating this environment must balance ambition with accountability, performance with integrity, and opportunity with responsibility. The stakes are personal, professional, and public, reflecting the high cost of life in the spotlight. The cycle of rise, scandal, and potential redemption underscores the intensity of the profession. Fame is fragile, influence is conditional, and trust is earned continuously, yet can be lost instantly. For the audience, these moments are dramatic and compelling. For the journalist, they are defining, career-altering, and often transformative. The lessons of celebrity scandals extend beyond the individual, illuminating the systemic pressures of modern sports media, the ethical imperatives of reporting, and the enduring tension between influence and accountability. As I reflect on the era of celebrity journalism, it becomes clear that scandals are neither anomalies nor accidents. They are the consequence of a landscape defined by speed, visibility, and influence. They reveal the human vulnerabilities behind professional performance and highlight the structural realities of a system that elevates visibility as much as accuracy. In understanding these dynamics, the profession, the audience, and the journalists themselves gain insight into the high stakes of fame and the enduring challenges of ethical reporting. There was a time when the journalist's role was clear: observe, report, and interpret. The game unfolded, and the reporter translated it for the audience with insight, accuracy, and context. That distinction has gradually faded, and I realized the moment I noticed familiar journalists eliciting cheers, boos, and viral reactions for commentary rather than analysis. Modern sports reporting has become inseparable from entertainment, and the boundary between journalist and performer is now porous, almost non-existent. I remember watching a primetime segment where journalists were tasked with debating a player's off-field behavior. It wasn't merely reporting, it was a performance designed to provoke reaction. The framing, the timing, and the delivery were crafted to engage emotionally. Ratings and audience engagement measured success as much as accuracy. Analysis alone was insufficient. Performance dictated perception. A journalist was expected to entertain as much as they were expected to inform. And the result was a hybrid profession. One where the skill set of the athlete and the storyteller intertwined in unexpected ways. The implications of this shift are profound. Entertainment as a core component of reporting transforms both the journalist and the audience. The journalist must cultivate personality, timing, and presence in addition to research, access, and analytical skill. The audience, meanwhile, begins to respond to drama, emotion, and spectacle as much as insight. Tweets, shares, and trending metrics influence decisions, shaping coverage priorities. Opinion, provocation, and commentary often supersede the measured reporting that once defined the profession. Engagement becomes the benchmark, performance the expectation. The economics of entertainment amplify these pressures. Networks, aware of the attention generated by engaging personalities, structure programming to highlight charisma, confrontation, and debate. Journalists who command attention are rewarded with higher visibility, better contracts, and greater influence. The most effective performers often dominate airtime, leaving traditional reporting in the shadows. The The profession rewards those who can perform under the spotlight consistently. And the blend of entertainment and journalism is no longer optional, it is essential for relevance. Social media intensifies the dynamic. Journalists' every word, facial expression, and gesture is immediately scrutinized and amplified. A debate show comment or viral clip can provoke national conversation. The audience reacts not merely to information, but to performance, tone, and delivery. For journalists, this means that influence is intertwined with emotional resonance. Success requires awareness of both content and presentation, and the demands of constant visibility create relentless pressure. Emotional labor is as central to the role as research, writing, or reporting. I recall speaking with a reporter who had navigated this shift with great skill. They described their work as performing truth. Analysis and reporting were inseparable from delivery and presence. They had to anticipate audience reaction, frame arguments compellingly, and maintain credibility while sustaining engagement. The work required continuous adjustment, balancing entertainment with integrity, performance with accuracy. They admitted that the line between journalism and theater blurred every day, and that their audience responded to the synthesis rather than either component alone. The blurring of roles also affects trust. Audiences often struggle to distinguish between fact and dramatization, between reporting and performance. Emotional delivery can overshadow objective insight, and viral moments can define perception regardless of accuracy. Journalists are increasingly evaluated not only by the reliability of their information, but by the intensity of their performance, the strength of their persona, and their ability to provoke discussion. Influence is as much about engagement as correctness. This phenomenon is evident across platforms. Television, digital streaming, podcasts, and social media all reward personalities capable of merging commentary with entertainment. Journalists are expected to maintain consistent visibility, cultivate distinctive voices, and craft narratives that resonate emotionally. Their value is measured in reach, impact, and audience loyalty, creating a continuous feedback loop in which performance reinforces influence, and influence incentivizes performance. The skills required extend beyond traditional journalistic training into presentation, strategy, and self-branding. I observe that this hybridization also shapes relationships with sources. Athletes, coaches, and executives recognize that visibility and audience response are powerful. Journalists with the largest platforms often gain preferential access, their opinions shaping perception as much as their reporting. The intertwining of reporting and performance influences the flow of information, access decisions, and even the framing of stories. Influence is amplified not merely by skill, but by the ability to engage, provoke, and sustain attention. The personal consequences are significant. Journalists operate under constant visibility, balancing professional responsibility with performance expectations. Emotional fatigue, stress, and the pressure to maintain persona are daily realities. The audience's attention is both rewarding and unforgiving, and errors or missteps are magnified. The blend of entertainer and reporter creates a dual identity in which credibility is inseparable from stage presence. Insight is inseparable from delivery, and professionalism is inseparable from performance. The evolution has also influenced the very content of journalism. Story selection, framing, and narrative emphasis are increasingly influenced by what will provoke discussion, generate reaction, or become shareable content. Analysis is shaped by the imperatives of engagement, and reporting decisions are informed by the potential for emotional resonance. The performance economy dictates not only how journalists present information, but what information is prioritized, how it is contextualized, and the manner in which it is amplified. Audience expectations have changed accordingly. Viewers anticipate not only insight, but entertainment, personality, and immediacy. They respond to provocation, debate, and dramatization, and those who fail to meet these expectations risk irrelevance. Success in modern sports journalism requires mastery of both content and performance. and the profession now rewards adaptability, charisma, and emotional resonance alongside traditional reporting skill. Ultimately, the blurring of the journalist and entertainer reflects deeper cultural shifts. Audiences crave immediacy, emotion, and engagement. Platforms reward attention, visibility, and amplification. Networks structure content around personalities capable of performing insightfully and dramatically. Journalists must navigate this environment while maintaining credibility, integrity, and analytical rigor. The dual demands of performance and reporting define the modern profession, shaping influence, access, and the public's understanding of the game. The era of journalist as entertainer demonstrates that the profession is no longer solely about observation and reporting. Success now requires a synthesis of insight, personality, and emotional impact. Influence is inseparable from performance, and credibility is intertwined with visibility. The audience engages not only with analysis, but with persona, presentation, and intensity. Modern sports journalism is a complex interplay of observation, commentary, and performance. And navigating this landscape requires a careful balance of skill, strategy, and stamina. As I reflect on the evolution of the profession, it is clear that the distinction between journalist and entertainer is now largely obsolete. The modern sports journalist is simultaneously observer, analyst, performer, and influencer. The audience responds to the synthesis. The networks reward the hybrid, and the profession has adapted accordingly. This transformation defines the current era of sports media, and it illustrates both the opportunities and pressures inherent in a landscape where analysis, insight, and performance are inseparable. The evolution of sports journalism into a realm where visibility, engagement, and performance are central has produced extraordinary opportunities. But it has also created an ethical tension that is impossible to ignore. I first noticed it during a period when breaking news cycles were dominated by clicks, shares, and trending metrics. Accuracy, once the unquestioned standard, often competed with speed and audience engagement. The journalist who delivered the fastest, most provocative version of a story frequently received more attention than the one who prioritized verification and nuance. A subtle but profound crisis emerged. Traction was sometimes more valuable than truth. The consequences are significant. Reporting that prioritizes virality can mislead audiences, misrepresent facts, and inadvertently damage careers. I recall an incident where a high-profile trade was reported prematurely. The story spread across social media in minutes, generating speculation, outrage, and commentary before confirmation was possible. Fans, athletes, and teams reacted to the report as though it were definitive, creating consequences that reverberated far beyond the initial post. Even after the story was corrected, the initial framing persisted in public memory, illustrating the asymmetric power of traction over accuracy. The erosion of old journalistic standards is subtle but cumulative. Practices such as multiple source verification, careful phrasing, and context setting, once central to reporting, are often compressed or bypassed in the pursuit of audience attention. Instant messaging, social platforms, and pressure for rapid publication create conditions where ethical lapses are more likely. The tension between professional responsibility and commercial incentive becomes a daily calculation. Journalists are acutely aware that delay may cost relevance, while error may cost credibility. Navigating this balance is fraught, emotionally taxing, and high stakes. The pressure to generate engagement affects story selection, framing, and even language. Headlines and teasers are crafted to provoke clicks, emotional reactions, or social sharing. Nuance is often sacrificed for impact. Controversy is amplified, speculation is incentivized, and narratives are framed to maximize traction rather than strictly convey verified information. This creates a landscape in which the most visible story may not be the most accurate, and where perception can outweigh fact in shaping public understanding. I remember speaking with a veteran journalist who reflected on this tension. The more I tried to get it right, the slower I felt. The faster I posted, the more I was rewarded. It was a constant internal negotiation: truth versus visibility, integrity versus influence. That insight crystallized a fundamental ethical dilemma of modern sports media. Audience engagement drives career opportunity, influence, and platform reach. But the pursuit of immediacy can compromise the core responsibility of reporting: to inform accurately and fairly. The problem is compounded by social media amplification. Once a story reaches the public, correction is often insufficient. Retweets, shares, and screenshots perpetuate the original narrative. Misstatements and incomplete reporting can persist long after clarification, leaving journalists to manage not only accuracy but the lasting effects of initial traction. Ethical lapses are magnified in this environment, not merely by mistakes themselves, but by the structural features of the platforms that reward speed, emotional resonance, and visibility. These crises are not hypothetical. Numerous cases demonstrate the tangible impact of prioritizing engagement over accuracy. Careers have been damaged, reputations tarnished, and audiences misled. Athletes have been mischaracterized, teams misrepresented, and events inaccurately framed. All because the incentive to be first or provocative outweighed the commitment to verify. Each instance underscores the fragility of trust in a system where attention often trumps truth. The tension between traction and accuracy also shapes newsroom culture. Editors, producers, and digital strategists increasingly emphasize metrics, engagement, and visibility as measures of success. Journalists are evaluated not solely on their ability to report comprehensively, but on their capacity to generate buzz, maintain audience attention, and sustain influence. This structural shift subtly pressures journalists to compromise verification or context in favor of speed, virality, or emotional resonance. Standards remain aspirational, but incentives are real, constant, and immediate. I observed firsthand how these dynamics influence decision-making. A reporter covering an off-field incident faced pressure to post quickly, knowing that delay would allow other outlets to dominate the narrative. Verification required patience and additional sources, but posting first offered engagement, clicks, and visibility. The resulting ethical tension was palpable. The choice was not abstract. It was practical, immediate, and career-defining. The journalist had to weigh the professional risk of inaccuracy against the strategic value of attention, all while knowing that social amplification would magnify the consequences of either decision. The erosion of standards is further intensified by the blending of news, opinion, and entertainment. Headlines are designed for impact. Social commentary is immediate. An analysis can be framed to provoke reaction rather than clarify truth. Audience behavior reinforces this model. Viral content is rewarded with attention. Non-viral content is overlooked. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Engagement is measured quantitatively, while accuracy is more subjective, and the incentives systematically favor speed, provocation, and emotional resonance over verification. At the heart of the ethical crisis is a fundamental question. Can journalism maintain credibility in an environment where attention drives opportunity? Social amplification, performative expectation, and competitive pressure create conditions in which traditional standards are constantly tested. Journalists must navigate the tension between professional responsibility, career ambition, and the structural incentives of modern platforms. The challenge is ethical, practical, and psychological, demanding skill, awareness, and judgment. The stakes are not merely professional. Ethical lapses affect public understanding, athlete reputations, and the broader cultural perception of sports. Audiences rely on journalists to contextualize, interpret, and verify information. When engagement is prioritized over truth, misperception spreads rapidly, and the journalist becomes both a messenger and an actor in a system where consequence and visibility are amplified. The responsibility is profound, and the margin for error is small. I spoke with an editor who explained, "We measure reach, but we cannot measure trust." The tension is constant. tensions, we win attention, but at what cost to credibility? That tension is the defining ethical challenge of the modern era. It reflects structural pressures, platform dynamics, and audience expectations. It also underscores the personal responsibility of journalists navigating the high-stakes intersection of truth, influence, and engagement. Ultimately, the ethical crises of modern sports journalism are a reflection of structural change, technological acceleration, and cultural expectation. Traction has become currency, visibility a measure of success, and the boundary between reporting and performance increasingly fluid. Maintaining integrity requires vigilance, courage, and constant negotiation. But the rewards and pressures of influence make compromise tempting, immediate, and often reinforced by audience and institutional incentives. The history of journalism teaches that standards are fragile, and trust is earned through consistent, accurate, and careful reporting. Modern pressures challenge these principles daily. The consequences of prioritizing engagement over truth are tangible, enduring, and systemic. They are observed not only in professional reputations, but in the trust between journalist and audience, the perception of events, and the broader understanding of the game itself. Ethical vigilance is no longer a principle, it is an active, daily necessity. As I reflect on the ethical crisis at the intersection of truth and engagement, it is clear that the dilemma defines modern sports media. The journalist must balance immediacy and accuracy, influence and integrity, performance and verification. The audience consumes rapidly, social media amplifies instantly, and structural incentives reward engagement. Navigating this terrain requires judgment, discipline, and resilience, and the consequences of miscalculation extend far beyond the individual journalist, shaping the profession and the culture of sport for decades to come. For decades, athletes existed primarily as subjects in the journalist's narrative. Their performances, decisions, and personal lives were filtered through the lens of reporters, commentators, and media outlets. I first realized the imbalance of power when a star player took to social media to correct a mischaracterization in a news story. The post went viral, generating discussion that overshadowed the original report. Athletes were no longer passive participants. They were claiming the power to shape perception, directly challenging journalists and establishing new channels of influence. The rise of athlete-controlled platforms has redefined the dynamic between media and subject. Players build personal brands, cultivate social followings, and deliver unmediated narratives. Twitter, Instagram, and now X and TikTok provide instantaneous access to millions, allowing athletes to communicate directly with fans. They can respond to criticism, contextualize events, and bypass traditional reporting entirely. The shift is both practical and symbolic. Athletes no longer rely solely on media intermediaries to tell their stories. Narrative control has expanded beyond locker rooms, press conferences, and interviews into digital public spaces. I recall a pivotal moment when a highly scrutinized quarterback posted a detailed explanation of a controversial incident. The media narrative had framed the situation negatively, emphasizing missteps and public perception. The quarterback's post, however, provided context, explanation, and a personal voice that reached millions within minutes. Reporters covering the story were forced to adapt, referencing the athlete's version of events and recalibrating their framing. The journalist, once the dominant arbiter of narrative, now had to negotiate influence with the subject. This shift is not limited to individual statements. Athletes increasingly use platforms to create long-form content, podcasts, and video series that offer behind-the-scenes perspectives on their careers. By doing so, they control timing, tone, and emphasis, building a direct relationship with the audience. Fans consume unfiltered narratives, forming opinions without mediation. For journalists, this represents a profound transformation. Influence is no longer absolute. Access, interpretation, and authority are now contested in real time, and athletes actively participate in shaping the discourse surrounding their careers. The implications for power dynamics in sports media are enormous. Traditional gatekeeping is eroded, and the journalist's authority is no longer unquestioned. Athletes can challenge misreporting, highlight errors, and redirect conversation, sometimes with consequences that reverberate across networks. The rise of athlete platforms creates a dual system in which both journalist and subject wield influence, often in tension. The audience, previously dependent on reporters for information, accesses multiple streams, blurring the lines between mediated truth and self-representation. I spoke with a former player who described the transition. We realized we didn't have to wait for someone to tell our story. We could speak directly, and people would listen. That changed the power dynamic forever. The observation captures the essence of modern sports media. Athletes are no longer passive players in the narrative. They are active architects, negotiating perception, reputation, and public understanding in real time. Influence is shared, contested, and dynamically reshaped. Athletes pushing back also shifts the journalist's responsibilities. Reporting now involves consideration of athlete-controlled content, audience interpretation, and the potential for immediate pushback. Every narrative choice carries new consequences. Traditional authority is tempered by visibility, audience access, and athlete engagement. Journalists must now navigate a landscape in which stories are co-constructed, contested, and sometimes preempted by the subjects themselves. The speed and intensity of digital platforms amplify both opportunity and pressure. The phenomenon extends beyond reactive responses. Some athletes strategically collaborate with journalists, offering exclusive insights while controlling framing. Access becomes a form of negotiation. Athletes choose when, how, and to whom they speak, leveraging personal platforms as bargaining tools. The journalist's ability to influence narrative is increasingly contingent on collaboration, credibility, and adaptability. In effect, media influence has become a co-managed ecosystem, in which the athlete's voice is as consequential as the reporter's. I remember covering a situation where a high-profile trade dominated the media cycle. Initially, reports circulated based on anonymous sources and speculation. Within hours, the athlete involved posted a personal video statement outlining their perspective. The story immediately shifted. Analysts referenced the player's statement, social media amplified it, and journalists incorporated it into reporting. The athlete had successfully inserted themselves into the narrative in a way that both challenged and complemented traditional coverage. The balance of authority had fundamentally changed. This shift also affects audience perception. Fans, increasingly aware of multiple perspectives, consume information from athlete platforms alongside traditional journalism. They develop nuanced views, sometimes questioning media framing and bias. The journalist, once the primary interpreter of events, now operates within a competitive and collaborative landscape of narrative authority. Accuracy, access, and insight remain critical, but influence is mediated by the subject's ability to reach and engage audiences independently. The rise of athlete platforms encourages transparency and direct accountability. When a player disputes a report, they do so publicly, exposing misinformation or misinterpretation. Audiences witness both claim and counterclaim, often forming opinions in real time. This heightened visibility forces journalists to maintain rigorous standards, verify sources, and consider the immediate ramifications of narrative framing. The public dimension of accountability has expanded, creating both challenge and opportunity for professional reporting. Yet the tension is palpable. Athlete-driven narratives can challenge journalism, but they can also manipulate perception, omit critical context, or prioritize branding over accuracy. The interplay between journalist and athlete is therefore complex, requiring discernment, skepticism, and analytical rigor. Journalists must adapt, balancing the subject's perspective with independent verification, ensuring credibility while navigating an increasingly collaborative and contested environment. Athletes fighting back represents a broader democratization of narrative control. It is a response to decades of concentrated media influence, a reclamation of agency, and an evolution in the relationship between subject and storyteller. For journalists, it is a call to adapt, refine ethical frameworks, and embrace transparency while navigating a landscape where influence is shared. The dynamic is ongoing, and the consequences are profound for both reporting practices and public perception. Ultimately, the rise of athlete-controlled narratives reflects a structural shift in modern sports media. Power is no longer centralized within journalism. It is distributed across platforms, subjects, and audiences. The journalist remains influential, but authority is negotiated, contested, and recalibrated with every story. Athletes assert their voice, reshape perception, and challenge traditional hierarchies, signaling a fundamental transformation in the ecology of sports reporting. The era of athletes fighting back demonstrates that narrative is no longer owned solely by those who cover the game. Players with strategic understanding of audience engagement and platform dynamics can assert influence, correct errors, and reshape public understanding. Journalists now operate within a more complex, contested, and dynamic field. Understanding this evolution is essential to comprehending the contemporary landscape of sports media, and it marks a decisive turning point in the power balance between subject and storyteller. Athletes are no longer lone players navigating the media landscape. Agents have become central figures in shaping narrative, managing perception, and controlling access. I first noticed the agent's role as a force in sports journalism during a contract negotiation that dominated headlines. Every public statement, every leak, and every reported rumor carried the subtle fingerprints of representation. Agents are not merely facilitators of deals. They are narrative architects, strategic intermediaries, and, at times, gatekeepers of truth. Their influence stretches far beyond negotiations, permeating the way journalists cover the game, frame stories, and interact with sources. The power dynamics between journalist and agent are delicate and complex. Journalists rely on access for scoops, exclusives, and insider information. Agents fully aware of this dependency can shape the flow of information, determine what is revealed, and control timing. In this environment, access becomes a currency. The journalist who maintains favor gains the stories, while those who challenge or question the narrative risk exclusion. It is a constant negotiation, a game of trust, leverage, and influence. The agent's presence behind the curtain fundamentally alters the relationship between journalist and athlete. I recall covering a high-profile free agency period where rumors of a major trade dominated the headlines. Journalists scrambled for confirmation, only to realize that much of the information circulating was strategically leaked by agents. The purpose was not simply to inform, but to influence perception, shape market conditions, and manage public response. Every report, every social media post was subtly guided by the agent's strategy. Journalists, aware of the manipulation but needing access, were forced to balance skepticism with the opportunity for exclusivity. The tension was palpable, a negotiation invisible to the audience, but central to the profession. Agents operate as both facilitators and manipulators. Their primary responsibility is to serve the athlete's interests, which may not always align with journalistic principles of verification and objectivity. Leaks can be timed to create pressure on teams, influence fan perception, or shape contract negotiations. Positive narratives can be amplified to enhance brand value, while negative stories can be mitigated or redirected. Journalists, in turn, must interpret, verify, and report amidst a landscape where information is curated, often intentionally, to achieve strategic goals. The ethical complexity is constant, requiring discernment, caution, and experience. I spoke with a veteran sports reporter who explained the subtle pressures agents introduce. You have to understand what's being handed to you. Some leaks are true, some are strategic. Knowing the difference and when to report is critical. Agents know how to use attention as leverage. That insight highlights the sophistication of modern sports representation. Agents are not passive intermediaries. They are active participants in the creation, dissemination, and framing of narratives that journalists rely upon. Access alone does not guarantee the accuracy or impartiality of information. The agent factor also complicates the relationship between athlete and journalist. While journalists seek truth, agents seek advantage. The result is a mediated reality in which every interaction, every statement, and every public moment may carry multiple layers of intent. The journalist must decode not only the athlete's perspective, but the strategic influence of their representation. The complexity requires critical judgment, professional discretion, and constant ethical vigilance. The stakes are high because misreporting can have tangible consequences for careers, contracts, and public perception. Agents also leverage media for personal and financial gain. High-profile representation involves managing narratives that enhance the athlete's marketability, endorsement potential, and public standing. Every public statement, appearance, end quote, is an instrument of strategy. Journalists, in turn, become participants in these strategies, sometimes knowingly, sometimes inadvertently. The process underscores the interdependence between media and representation and reveals the subtle, often unseen dynamics that shape what fans ultimately consume. The economic and strategic stakes heighten the tension. Major trades, free agency decisions, and endorsement deals often hinge on perception. Leaks and carefully curated statements can influence bargaining positions, manipulate fan sentiment, or create pressure on teams. Journalists report these events, aware that the information may be intentionally framed. The power of narrative becomes a tool, and agents are the unseen architects. Success requires an understanding of both the surface story and the motivations behind it. I remember an agent who openly acknowledged the dual role they play: protector of the client and mediator of information. Their strategic approach included timing statements, shaping narratives, and cultivating favorable relationships with journalists. The journalist must navigate this landscape carefully. Too much skepticism risks losing access. Too little can compromise objectivity. The balance between truth-telling and relationship management is delicate, and the consequences of misjudgment are real. The agent factor highlights the interlocking networks that define modern sports journalism. Stories are rarely isolated. They are products of negotiation, strategy, and influence. The journalist exists in a complex ecosystem in which information flows through multiple nodes of fleet, K-agent, league sources, and colleagues. Each node carries intent, leverage, and influence. Understanding the system is as critical to reporting as traditional investigative skill. The professional environment demands a keen awareness of incentives, context, and the dynamics of power behind every narrative. Ethically, this landscape is challenging. Journalists are tasked with delivering accurate, unbiased information to the public while navigating the influence of agents whose goals are strategic and self-interested. Every quote, rumor, or leak is filtered through a layer of intent. Reporters must discern fact from manipulation, verify independently, and provide context. The professional responsibility to the audience is heightened, requiring vigilance, judgment, and ethical rigor. The stakes extend far beyond personal credibility. Careers, reputations, and contracts are all influenced by what is reported and how. Ultimately, the agent factor reshapes modern sports journalism in profound ways. Influence is no longer confined to the athlete. It is distributed through a network of representation that mediates access, information, and perception. Journalists must navigate this environment with care, understanding the motivations behind the information they receive, and balancing the pursuit of exclusivity with the imperatives of accuracy and integrity. The profession operates within a web of power, strategy, and negotiation. Athletes, agents, and journalists form an ecosystem in which access, influence, and credibility are constantly negotiated. Every story, statement, and public interaction is shaped by these dynamics, revealing the complexity behind the seemingly straightforward act of reporting a game, trade, or controversy. Understanding the agent factor is essential for anyone seeking to comprehend the modern media landscape. The pressures on journalists and the mechanisms through which narratives are constructed, amplified, and sometimes weaponized. In this environment, the journalist's role is both more challenging and more consequential than ever. Success requires an understanding of relationships, incentives, and strategy, in addition to traditional reporting skills. Each story becomes a negotiation of accuracy, access, and interpretation, with agents exerting influence behind the scenes. The capacity to navigate this terrain shapes not only professional credibility, but also the audience's perception of the athlete, the team, and the sport itself. The agent factor, subtle yet pervasive, exemplifies the layered complexity of modern sports reporting. It illustrates the unseen dynamics that determine which stories reach the public, how narratives are framed, and who ultimately controls the discourse. The journalist's role is no longer purely observational. It is a negotiation within a system of influence, strategy, and representation. Recognizing this reality is essential for understanding both the opportunities and constraints of contemporary sports media. Sports have always been a domain of triumph, glory, and celebration, but they are not immune to tragedy. I first understood the true weight of crisis reporting the day I covered a catastrophic injury that changed a player's career and life. The initial shock on the field was compounded by the realization that my words, framing, and my analysis would shape public understanding of the moment for years to come. In those first minutes, the reporter is not merely a witness. They become a conduit for collective grief, a translator of trauma, and a custodian of context. Every choice in language, tone, and timing carries enormous responsibility. The emotional toll of crisis reporting is immense. I remember standing near the locker room entrance, watching paramedics attend to a player whose career and possibly life had just shifted dramatically. The audience expected information, clarity, and narrative. Yet the reality of the situation was chaotic, uncertain, and deeply human. In that moment, the journalist must navigate a dual obligation: convey factual information while preserving dignity, respecting privacy, and maintaining composure. It is an intense balancing act, one that rarely leaves room for error or emotional distance. Covering tragedies, whether severe injuries, deaths, or criminal incidents, forces journalists to confront their own vulnerability. The immediacy of the event, the scrutiny of an audience hungry for detail, and the ethical imperative to remain accurate and measured create pressures that extend beyond professional responsibility. Emotional fatigue is inevitable. I have spoken with colleagues who describe sleepless nights, replaying details, weighing the appropriateness of every word. The line between professional duty and personal empathy is narrow, and crossing it unintentionally can have profound consequences. Crisis reporting also tests the ethical foundations of the profession. In moments of uncertainty, rumors spread faster than verified information. Social media accelerates the dissemination of unconfirmed details, amplifying speculation and potential harm. Journalists must resist the impulse to fill gaps with conjecture, yet the audience demands immediacy. The tension between urgency and accuracy is amplified, and missteps can damage credibility, misinform the public, or cause further harm to those already affected. Each decision carries moral weight, reminding the reporter that influence is inseparable from responsibility. I recall covering an off-field incident involving a player implicated in a criminal investigation. Every statement, every reported fact, required careful verification, yet the pressure to provide updates in real time was relentless. Sources offered conflicting accounts, emotions ran high, and the public's appetite for news was insatiable. The experience highlighted a crucial lesson. Crisis reporting is never merely about facts. It is about context, empathy, and the recognition that words carry consequences for individuals, families, and communities. The audience, in turn, engages with crisis reporting differently than with ordinary sports coverage. Fans seek clarity, but also reassurance, resolution, and meaning. The journalist becomes a mediator between raw events and public comprehension, translating complexity into understanding while retaining fidelity to truth. The stakes are heightened because these moments are emotionally charged, culturally resonant, and often permanent in collective memory. Reporting missteps can reverberate for years, influencing both perception and reputation. Athletes, teams, and organizations are acutely aware of the weight journalists carry in crisis coverage. Public statements, press conferences, and interviews are carefully calibrated, recognizing that every word may be interpreted through the lens of media narrative. The journalist operates within this ecosystem, navigating competing pressures from institutional stakeholders, personal sources, and the consuming audience. Accuracy, discretion, and timing are essential, and ethical lapses are magnified in proportion to the event's visibility and severity. Crisis reporting often reveals the intersection of journalism, ethics, and human vulnerability. Journalists must make real-time decisions about what to report, how to report it, and how to contextualize events for an audience that may include millions of emotionally invested viewers. Misjudgment can magnify grief, distort perception, or unfairly target individuals. Precision in language, sensitivity to circumstance, and clarity in explanation are all critical. Yet the pressure of immediacy often conflicts with deliberation. The journalist's judgment becomes the defining factor in shaping narrative responsibly. I recall interviewing a seasoned reporter who had covered multiple on-field fatalities. They described the experience as a form of responsibility unlike any other. You are the lens through which the world sees the tragedy. Every word matters. You can't hide behind facts alone. Empathy, care, and judgment are inseparable from your reporting. That reflection captures the essence of crisis journalism. It is as much about human stewardship as it is about information dissemination. The emotional labor is intrinsic, unavoidable, and fundamental to professional integrity. The role of technology adds both challenge and support. Instant communication allows journalists to verify details quickly, but it also amplifies scrutiny, spreads unverified reports, and accelerates public reaction. Digital platforms magnify errors, misunderstandings, or incomplete information, creating high-stakes conditions in which accuracy and composure are continually tested. The journalist's responsibility extends beyond the story itself to the broader ecosystem of interpretation, dissemination, and audience engagement. Crisis reporting also underscores the interconnectedness of the sports ecosystem. Players, coaches, teams, leagues, families, and fans all intersect in moments of tragedy. Journalists mediate these relationships, translating events into narrative while negotiating access, confidentiality, and ethics. The stakes are both personal and systemic. Misreporting can alter careers, influence public sentiment, and even affect legal outcomes. The weight of responsibility is omnipresent, and the margin for error is minimal. The emotional burden of reporting on crises is compounded by professional expectations. Journalists are expected to maintain objectivity, deliver updates in real time, and sustain professional composure. The human element, the empathy, shock, and moral concern must coexist with analytical precision. The emotional labor is invisible to the audience, yet it is foundational to credible, responsible reporting. Sustaining this balance over a career requires discipline, reflection, and resilience. Ultimately, crisis reporting in sports reveals the profound ethical and emotional responsibilities embedded in modern journalism. Every narrative decision, every word, and every report carries weight beyond immediate consumption. Accuracy, verification, and ethical judgment are inseparable from the human consequences of coverage. The journalist's role is magnified in times of trauma, positioning them as both observer and mediator, interpreter and custodian, performer and ethical agent. As I reflect on the intersection of crisis, responsibility, and journalism, it becomes clear that these moments define the character of the profession. The stakes are both immediate and enduring, affecting audiences, athletes, organizations, and culture. Success in crisis reporting requires mastery of skill, moral discernment, and emotional intelligence. The reporter carries a responsibility that extends beyond information to respect, contextualize, and humanize. The weight of this role is heavy, constant, and unavoidable. Yet it is the defining measure of professional integrity in the most challenging moments of sports media. Sports journalism was long a domain dominated by men. For decades, female voices were rare, often dismissed, and sometimes outright excluded from locker rooms, press conferences, and sidelines. I first became aware of the disparity when I observed a young reporter struggle to gain access during a major playoff series. She faced questions not about her reporting skills, but about her presence in the environment. The implicit assumption was that sports commentary, analysis, and coverage were inherently masculine territories. Yet, over time, women carved pathways into this landscape, challenging institutional bias, confronting skepticism, and ultimately transforming the culture of sports media. The barriers were systemic. Early female journalists faced practical restrictions, such as exclusion from locker rooms and travel accommodations, but also social and professional skepticism. Their credibility was questioned, their knowledge doubted, and their authority often undermined. Yet persistence, talent, and strategic positioning enabled women to assert themselves. I recall reading about pioneers who insisted on equal access, fought for accreditation, and demanded respect, often at significant personal and professional cost. Their efforts laid the groundwork for the generation that followed, demonstrating that expertise and presence could overcome entrenched prejudice. Breakthroughs in the field were often catalyzed by cultural shifts. Title IX, changes in workplace law, and evolving social norms gradually opened doors. Networks recognized the value of diverse perspectives, not just as a matter of equity, but also as an enhancement to storytelling and audience engagement. Female journalists brought nuanced insight, alternative framing, and fresh analysis, enriching the coverage of games, teams, and athletes. These shifts reshaped newsroom culture and began to challenge long-held assumptions about who could report, analyze, and narrate sports stories. Historical case studies illustrate both the struggle and the achievement. In the 1970s, pioneers like Leslie Vizar and Phyllis George faced obstacles ranging from limited access to overt skepticism. Vizar, for example, had to fight for locker room access at major sporting events, challenging conventions that relegated women to sidelines or studio commentary. Her persistence not only allowed her to cover games comprehensively, but also created a precedent for equitable access. George, as a television host and commentator, blended charisma with substantive reporting, demonstrating that presence, authority, and insight were not exclusive to male journalists. Personal reflection reveals the cultural weight of these transformations. Observing female journalists navigate hostile environments, yet persist with professionalism, skill, and grace, highlighted the resilience required to succeed. I recall covering a championship where female reporters were fully integrated into the press corps, conducting interviews, analyzing strategy, and breaking news with the same authority as their male colleagues. The contrast to earlier decades was stark. What was once a barrier-laden environment had become a stage where competence, preparation, and insight mattered more than gender. The evolution has not been without friction. Female sports journalists continue to face harassment, both online and in person. They contend with stereotypes, unequal pay, and persistent questions about their authority. Social media, while providing platforms for amplification, also exposes women to heightened scrutiny and abuse. Yet despite these challenges, female voices have reshaped sports media. Their presence is no longer peripheral. It is central, integral to how narratives are constructed, framed, and disseminated. The contributions of women in sports journalism extend beyond mere representation. They influence the types of stories covered, the framing of issues, and the depth of analysis. Female journalists often highlight underreported perspectives, draw attention to social and cultural dynamics, and bring empathetic insight into player experiences. The profession has evolved because of their contributions, and audiences benefit from the broadened scope, deeper context, and richer storytelling they provide. I have observed firsthand the interplay between cultural perception and professional accomplishment. A female journalist covering an international tournament was initially underestimated, yet her reporting became a benchmark for analytical depth and accuracy. Her presence forced colleagues, executives, and audiences alike to recalibrate assumptions about expertise and authority. These moments reveal a subtle but powerful transformation. Competence and insight increasingly supersede bias. Though challenges remain, networks and organizations have also played a role in facilitating change. Mentorship programs, recruitment efforts, and conscious inclusion strategies have expanded opportunities for women. Yet the most profound shifts have occurred through individual persistence, talent, and innovation. Pioneering women did not merely participate. They reshaped norms, established standards, and created pathways for subsequent generations. Their impact is enduring, affecting not only hiring practices but also the very culture of sports reporting. The evolution of female sports journalists is inseparable from broader societal changes. Cultural expectations around gender, authority, and professionalism have shifted, creating a context in which women's voices are recognized, valued, and influential. However, the struggle is ongoing. Structural inequities, bias, and harassment persist, reminding the profession that progress requires vigilance, advocacy, and continued engagement. Success is not a destination, but an ongoing process, defined by resilience, excellence, and the refusal to be marginalized. Athlete interactions have evolved alongside these changes. Players, coaches, and executives increasingly recognize the professionalism of female journalists, engaging with them in interviews, press briefings, and commentary. The dynamic of reporting has shifted from skepticism to respect, though exceptions persist. The credibility of female journalists now rests primarily on skill, preparation, and insight, rather than gender conformity. This reflects not only individual accomplishment, but systemic cultural evolution within the sports media ecosystem. Audience perception is equally important. Fans increasingly accept and expect diverse voices in sports journalism. Women have demonstrated expertise, authority, and analytical depth, challenging stereotypes and expanding the parameters of what constitutes legitimate sports coverage. Social media, podcasts, and personal platforms have amplified their reach, providing channels to connect directly with audiences, build credibility, and shape narratives in ways that were once impossible. The intersection of gender and journalism also highlights ethical and professional imperatives. Women reporting in male-dominated sports must navigate both traditional reporting responsibilities and additional pressures related to bias, harassment, and perception. Their success requires a combination of skill, resilience, and strategic navigation of institutional structures. Observing their journey underscores the evolving complexity of modern sports media, where competence, ethics, and adaptability intersect with social change and cultural expectation. Ultimately, the evolution of female sports journalists represents both transformation and continuity. Barriers persist, but progress is undeniable. Women have reshaped the profession, expanded narrative capacity, and challenged assumptions about authority, expertise, and legitimacy. The professional landscape is broader, more inclusive, and more complex because of their contributions. Their stories illuminate the intersection of gender, media, and sports culture, demonstrating that resilience, insight, and talent can redefine long-standing norms. Reflecting on these shifts, I am struck by the dual narrative of challenge and achievement. The path of female sports journalists has been marked by resistance, perseverance, and eventual breakthrough. Their work has enriched reporting, deepened analysis, and broadened the scope of audience engagement. They have claimed space in an environment that once excluded them, demonstrating that authority, insight, and narrative power are not bound by gender, but earned through professionalism, skill, and courage. The legacy of this evolution continues to unfold. Today's female journalists inherit a history of struggle and triumph. Yet they also face new challenges in digital engagement, audience scrutiny, and rapid news cycles. Their ongoing presence shapes not only how games are reported, but also how stories are framed, how culture is represented, and how audiences interpret the sports world. The evolution is both historical and immediate, living testament to the capacity for change in professional media environments. I have always been fascinated by the relationship between journalists and the audience. Sports fans are tribal by nature, and journalists occupy a position of extraordinary influence within those tribes. I first became aware of this power while observing a heated debate among fans following a mid-season controversy. The conversation, heated and deeply personal, was shaped less by what had actually happened on the field and more by the way a prominent journalist had framed it. The reporter's analysis, delivered with authority and nuance, became a reference point for thousands of fans, guiding opinions, judgments, and allegiances. In essence, journalists can act as tribal leaders, structuring perception and mediating the emotional experience of fandom. The psychology behind this influence is rooted in parasocial relationships. Fans develop a sense of intimacy and trust with journalists, consuming their commentary as though it were advice from a trusted confidant. This bond is asymmetrical. The audience feels connected, while the journalist maintains professional distance. Yet the effect is profound. A single column, broadcast segment, or social media post can reorient perceptions, intensify loyalty, or inflame outrage. Fans internalize the journalist's perspective, often more than the objective reality of the events themselves. I have watched entire fan bases debate not the facts of a game, but the narrative lens through which those facts were presented. This influence extends to identity formation. Fans often align themselves not only with teams, but with the voices they trust to interpret the game. I recall a case in which a respected columnist's framing of a controversial trade caused previously rival fan groups to adopt a surprisingly similar perspective, shifting the dynamics of discourse across forums, social media, and local conversations. The journalist's voice became a rallying point, a mediator of belief systems within the fan community. In a sense, reporting ceases to be neutral information and becomes a guidepost for identity, loyalty, and emotional investment. The tribal aspect of fandom amplifies the stakes for journalists. Every statement carries potential consequences: reinforcement of beliefs, escalation of rivalries, or creation of division. The reporter's authority is perceived as both analytical and moral. Fans turn to trusted voices for validation, justification, and explanation. I've observed the rapid spread of opinion once a journalist publishes a definitive take on a contentious event. The speed, breadth, and intensity of response underscore the journalist's role as a psychological and social anchor within the tribe. Social media magnifies this phenomenon exponentially. Platforms enable fans to interact with, amplify, and sometimes confront journalists directly. The immediacy of response fosters a feedback loop. Journalists receive validation, critique, and engagement in real time, which can influence subsequent reporting. Parasocial trust is both enhanced and tested. I remember a situation in which a journalist's preliminary analysis provoked thousands of tweets, fan threads, and forum debates. The discourse was not just about the game. It was about the journalist's interpretation, the authority of their voice, and the credibility of their judgment. The reporter's influence extended far beyond the playing field, shaping the culture and conversation of the fan community. Journalists who understand and navigate this dynamic can wield extraordinary influence. They do not merely report games, they curate the experience of fandom. By framing narratives, highlighting context, and emphasizing certain perspectives, They guide interpretation, emotional engagement, and even social discourse. Fans adopt these narratives as reference points, incorporating them into their own understanding, commentary, and interactions. The power to shape collective perception is immense, and with it comes ethical and professional responsibility. I have observed the subtle ways in which journalists exercise this influence. Choice of language, framing of events, and the selection of quotes all contribute to shaping fan perception. For instance, a description of a player's performance as heroic versus reckless can transform debate, alter public sentiment, and influence legacy. In the tribal context of sports, language becomes a tool of persuasion, not merely description. Fans internalize the framing, often without conscious awareness, making the journalist a central arbiter of interpretation. The psychology of parasocial trust also explains the intensity of backlash when fans perceive misjudgment or bias. I have seen journalists face coordinated criticism, personal attacks, and reputational threats when a perceived error challenges the tribe's beliefs or disrupts loyalty. The relationship is inherently fragile. Influence is powerful, but it is constantly evaluated, contested, and reaffirmed by the audience. This dynamic reinforces the dual responsibility journalists bear to maintain credibility while navigating the emotional intensity of fan tribes. Beyond individual games or events, journalists shape broader cultural narratives within sports. Rivalries, legacies, and team mythology are often constructed, amplified, and perpetuated through reporting. I have traced how coverage of dynastic teams, controversial decisions, or emerging talent creates lasting frameworks for fan understanding. Journalists do not merely comment on performance. They contribute to the construction of meaning, the codification of heroes and villains, and the organization of collective memory. Their influence persists long after the final whistle. The intersection of fan culture and journalistic influence also highlights ethical tensions. Curating narratives for engagement can conflict with the imperative to present unbiased, accurate reporting. The desire to capture attention, generate discussion, or appeal to the emotional investment of fans can tempt journalists to overstate, dramatize, or selectively highlight. Balancing narrative power with factual integrity is a central challenge in modern sports reporting, particularly when parasocial trust amplifies both influence and scrutiny. I recall a situation in which a journalist's nuanced critique of a star player was misinterpreted by the fan base as personal bias. The fallout was immediate, with fans debating not the merits of the argument, but the journalist's character and authority. This incident underscored the precarious position reporters occupy. Their words are amplified, dissected, and internalized, often in ways beyond their control. Influence is inseparable from responsibility, and every communication carries potential consequences for perception, identity, and culture. Journalists who embrace the role of tribal leaders must understand the socio-cultural mechanics of fandom. They guide interpretation, mediate emotional engagement, and translate complexity into digestible narratives. They provide context, validate insights, and offer perspective. In doing so, they become trusted arbiters, shaping the lens through which fans experience, understand, and connect with the sport. The influence is profound, sustained, and deeply intertwined with cultural identity. Ultimately, fan culture and parasocial trust demonstrate that journalism is not merely a conduit of information. It is a mechanism for social cohesion, identity formation, and emotional mediation. Reporters occupy a unique position within these ecosystems, guiding belief, shaping loyalty, and influencing interpretation. Understanding this dynamic is essential to comprehending the modern sports media environment, the psychology of fandom, and the power inherent in narrative authority. The journalist as tribal leader reflects both opportunity and obligation. Influence carries the responsibility to report accurately, frame fairly, and navigate emotional intensity with care. Every decision shapes perception, every word contributes to identity, and every story participates in a broader cultural dialogue. The weight of authority is magnified by the intimate bond fans feel. creating a system in which professional judgment, ethical rigor, and narrative skill are inseparable from impact. Sports journalism was long a domain dominated by men. For decades, female voices were rare, often dismissed, and sometimes outright excluded from locker rooms, press conferences, and sidelines. I first became aware of the disparity when I observed a young reporter struggle to gain access during a major playoff series. She faced questions not about her reporting skills, but about her presence in the environment. The implicit assumption was that sports commentary, analysis, and coverage were inherently masculine territories. Yet, over time, women carved pathways into this landscape, challenging institutional bias, confronting skepticism, and ultimately transforming the culture of sports media. The barriers were systemic. Early female journalists faced practical restrictions, such as exclusion from locker rooms and travel accommodations, but also social and professional skepticism. Their credibility was questioned, their knowledge doubted, and their authority often undermined. Yet persistence, talent, and strategic positioning enabled women to assert themselves. I recall reading about pioneers who insisted on equal access, fought for accreditation, and demanded respect, often at significant personal and professional cost. Their efforts laid the groundwork for the generation that followed, demonstrating that expertise and presence could overcome entrenched prejudice. Breakthroughs in the field were often catalyzed by cultural shifts. Title X, changes in workplace law, and evolving social norms gradually opened doors. Networks recognized the value of diverse perspectives, not just as a matter of equity, but also as an enhancement to storytelling and audience engagement. Female journalists brought nuanced insight, alternative framing, and fresh analysis, enriching the coverage of games, teams, and athletes. These shifts reshaped newsroom culture and began to challenge long-held assumptions about who could report, analyze, and narrate sports stories. Historical case studies illustrate both the struggle and the achievement. In the 1970s, pioneers like Leslie Vizar and Phyllis George faced obstacles ranging from limited access to overt skepticism. Vizar, for example, had to fight for locker room access at major sporting events, challenging conventions that relegated women to sidelines or studio commentary. Her persistence not only allowed her to cover games comprehensively, but also created a precedent for equitable access. George, as a television host and commentator, blended charisma with substantive reporting, demonstrating that presence, authority, and insight were not exclusive to male journalists. Personal reflection reveals the cultural weight of these transformations. Observing female journalists navigate hostile environments, yet persist with professionalism, skill, and grace, highlighted the resilience required to succeed. I recall covering a championship where female reporters were fully integrated into the press corps, conducting interviews, analyzing strategy, and breaking news with the same authority as their male colleagues. The contrast to earlier decades was stark. What was once a barrier-laden environment had become a stage where confidence, preparation, and insight mattered more than gender. The evolution has not been without friction. Female sports journalists continue to face harassment, both online and in person. They contend with stereotypes, unequal pay, and persistent questions about their authority. Social media, while providing platforms for amplification, also exposes women to heightened scrutiny and abuse. Yet despite these challenges, female voices have reshaped sports media. Their presence is no longer peripheral. It is central, integral to how narratives are constructed, framed, and disseminated. The contributions of women in sports journalism extend beyond mere representation. They influence the types of stories covered, the framing of issues, and the depth of analysis. Female journalists often highlight underreported perspectives, draw attention to social and cultural dynamics, and bring empathetic insight into player experiences. The profession has evolved because of their contributions, and audiences benefit from the broadened scope, deeper context, and richer storytelling they provide. I have observed firsthand the interplay between cultural perception and professional accomplishment. A female journalist covering an international tournament was initially underestimated, yet her reporting became a benchmark for analytical depth and accuracy. Her presence forced colleagues, executives, and audiences alike to recalibrate assumptions about expertise and authority. These moments reveal a subtle but powerful transformation. Competence and insight increasingly supersede bias. Though challenges remain, networks and organizations have also played a role in facilitating change. Mentorship programs, recruitment efforts, and conscious inclusion strategies have expanded opportunities for women. Yet the most profound shifts have occurred through individual persistence, talent, and innovation. Pioneering women did not merely participate. They reshaped norms, established standards, and created pathways for subsequent generations. Their impact is enduring, affecting not only hiring practices but also the very culture of sports reporting. The evolution of female sports journalists is inseparable from broader societal changes. Cultural expectations around gender, authority, and professionalism have shifted, creating a context in which women's voices are recognized, valued, and influential. However, the struggle is ongoing. Structural inequities, bias, and harassment persist, reminding the profession that progress requires vigilance, advocacy, and continued engagement. Success is not a destination, but an ongoing process, defined by resilience, excellence, and the refusal to be marginalized. Athlete interactions have evolved alongside these changes. Players, coaches, and executives increasingly recognize the professionalism of female journalists, engaging with them in interviews, press briefings, and commentary. The dynamic of reporting has shifted from skepticism to respect, though exceptions persist. The credibility of female journalists now rests primarily on skill, preparation, and insight, rather than gender conformity. This reflects not only individual accomplishment, but systemic cultural evolution within the sports media ecosystem. Audience perception is equally important. Fans increasingly accept and expect diverse voices in sports journalism. Women have demonstrated expertise, authority, and analytical depth, challenging stereotypes and expanding the parameters of what constitutes legitimate sports coverage. Social media, podcasts, and personal platforms have amplified their reach, providing channels to connect directly with audiences, build credibility, and shape narratives in ways that were once impossible. The intersection of gender and journalism also highlights ethical and professional imperatives. Women reporting in male-dominated sports must navigate both traditional reporting responsibilities and additional pressures related to bias, harassment, and perception. Their success requires a combination of skill, resilience, and strategic navigation of institutional structures. Observing their journey underscores the evolving complexity of modern sports media, where competence, ethics, and adaptability intersect with social change and cultural expectation. Ultimately, the evolution of female sports journalists represents both transformation and continuity. Barriers persist, but progress is undeniable. Women have reshaped the profession, expanded narrative capacity, and challenged assumptions about authority, expertise, and legitimacy. The professional landscape is broader, more inclusive, and more complex because of their contributions. Their stories illuminate the intersection of gender, media, and sports culture, demonstrating that resilience, insight, and talent can redefine long-standing norms. Reflecting on these shifts, I am struck by the dual narrative of challenge and achievement. The path of female sports journalists has been marked by resistance, perseverance, and eventual breakthrough. Their work has enriched reporting, deepened analysis, and broadened the scope of audience engagement. They have claimed space in an environment that once excluded them, demonstrating that authority, insight, and narrative power are not bound by gender, but earned through professionalism, skill, and courage. The legacy of this evolution continues to unfold. Today's female journalists inherit a history of struggle and triumph. Yet they also face new challenges in digital engagement, audience scrutiny, and rapid news cycles. Their ongoing presence shapes not only how games are reported, but also how stories are framed, how culture is represented, and how audiences interpret the sports world. The evolution is both historical and immediate, living testament to the capacity for change in professional media environments. The landscape of sports journalism is evolving at a speed few could have anticipated. I first encountered the seismic shift when a young journalist broke a story via a platform that did not exist a decade earlier. It was a TikTok video, 30 seconds long, that delivered insight, analysis, and context with immediacy and personality. Fans consumed it voraciously, shared it widely, and debated it passionately. The medium was unconventional, but the impact was undeniable. This moment crystallized a new reality. The next generation of journalists is platform agnostic, entrepreneurial, and intimately connected with their audience in ways traditional media never anticipated. Social media platforms like TikTok, X, and YouTube have created spaces where journalists operate independently, building brands, cultivating followings, and engaging audiences directly. The barriers to entry are lower, but the competition is fiercer. I have observed emerging reporters producing high-quality analysis without institutional support, leveraging camera presence, editing skills, and storytelling ability to reach tens or hundreds of thousands of fans. The democratization of media has empowered voices previously marginalized or overlooked, while simultaneously increasing the stakes of credibility, influence, and audience perception. Podcasts have also reshaped sports reporting. I recall listening to an independent sports podcast that dissected strategy, insider information, and player performance with rigor, nuance, and depth. Unlike traditional outlets constrained by airtime or editorial oversight, these platforms offer flexibility, personality-driven analysis, and intimate connection with audiences. Listeners feel engaged, often developing parasocial trust in hosts, whose insights shape perceptions of teams, players, and narratives. The rise of audio content emphasizes storytelling, contextual depth, and sustained engagement, while complementing the instant gratification of social media reporting. The independent media boom has created opportunities for journalists to define themselves outside traditional gatekeepers. I have spoken with reporters who left established networks to create their own channels, podcasts, and content hubs. They are accountable to audiences rather than corporations, cultivating authenticity, transparency, and responsiveness. Yet, independence comes with responsibility. Verification, ethical standards, and narrative accuracy are unmediated by institutional oversight. These journalists must navigate credibility, audience trust, and brand identity in an ecosystem where mistakes can be amplified instantly. The next generation journalist also engages directly with fans in ways that were previously unimaginable. Live Q&A sessions, real-time analysis on streaming platforms, and interactive content create a participatory culture. Audiences no longer passively consume. They challenge, critique, and collaborate. I observed a young reporter fielding questions about a controversial trade during a live stream, responding with insight while balancing the emotional intensity of fan reactions. The dynamic shifts the journalist's role from distant observer to active participant in the communal experience of sports fandom. Platform fluency is now as essential as traditional reporting skill. TikTok requires brevity and visual storytelling. X demands immediacy and concise framing. Podcasts call for narrative skill and vocal presence. And YouTube combines long-form analysis with editing and pacing expertise. The modern journalist must be versatile, adaptive, and technologically literate, navigating multiple modalities while maintaining journalistic integrity. I have encountered reporters who thrive across platforms, using each to extend reach, diversify storytelling, and reinforce credibility. Their success is predicated on both skill and audience insight. The next generation is also characterized by transparency and engagement with sources. Unlike the traditional gatekeeper model, independent journalists often share methodology, verification steps, and the rationale behind their reporting. This approach cultivates trust, demonstrating that analysis is grounded in evidence, not bias. I have noted that audiences respond positively to transparency, valuing insight into both process and perspective. This trend highlights a shift in journalism. Trust is co-created, not simply inherited from institutional authority. Economic models for emerging journalists are equally diverse. Brand partnerships, crowdfunding, subscription-based platforms, and monetized social media presence enable reporters to sustain independent operations. I have seen journalists grow small followings into substantial media ventures, creating professional autonomy previously inaccessible outside traditional networks. Yet with financial independence comes heightened responsibility, maintaining integrity, resisting sensationalism for clicks, and ensuring reporting remains accurate and ethical. The stakes are both professional and moral, reinforcing the dual imperatives of sustainability and credibility. Cultural shifts also define the next generation journalist. Audiences increasingly value diversity of perspective, representation, and authenticity. I have observed reporters integrating personal insight, lived experience, and social context into coverage, expanding the boundaries of what sports journalism can encompass. Stories are not just about statistics and performance. They explore social dynamics, player agency, and cultural resonance. This holistic approach enriches understanding and resonates with audiences who demand both information and insight. The digital savvy journalist navigates an ecosystem where narrative control is contested. Fans, agents, players, and peers all influence the story in real time. I have witnessed the instantaneous spread of information, speculation, and reaction, creating a landscape where credibility, clarity, and speed are simultaneously tested. The journalist becomes both mediator and participant, balancing fact, interpretation, and audience expectation. The interplay between influence, transparency, and ethical responsibility is continuous, shaping both perception and professional standing. Platforms also create opportunities for niche expertise. I have encountered journalists specializing in statistical analysis, tactical breakdowns, or historical context who reach audiences globally, cultivating authority without relying on traditional networks. These voices contribute depth, nuance, and diversity to public understanding, highlighting how technology expands both reach and scope. Expertise can now be recognized and amplified independently, reinforcing the professional evolution of sports media. The next generation journalist is defined by agility, credibility, and connection. The profession demands skill across multiple domains: investigative reporting, digital fluency, storytelling, audience engagement, and ethical rigor. I've observed emerging reporters seamlessly integrating live coverage, analytical content, and audience interaction, producing work that is immediate, insightful, and resonant. Their success demonstrates that influence is earned through competence, adaptability, and trust building, rather than simply inherited from institutional affiliation. I have reflected on the psychological dimension of audience engagement. Parasocial relationships, trust, and loyalty are intensified in platforms that allow direct interaction. Fans internalize analysis, adopt perspectives, and shape discourse around these voices. The next generation journalist navigates this terrain with both opportunity and ethical responsibility, aware that influence extends beyond information to cultural framing, identity, and perception. Every post, video, or podcast carries the potential to shape belief and sentiment in ways immediate and lasting. Ultimately, the next generation journalist exemplifies the evolution of the profession. Independent media, social platforms, and audience-centric reporting create both challenges and unprecedented opportunities. The journalist's role has expanded beyond reporting to encompass brand, community engagement, and cross-platform storytelling. Competence, integrity, and adaptability define success, while the digital landscape amplifies both reach and responsibility. This generation operates in a dynamic, complex ecosystem where influence is immediate, transparency is demanded, and professional credibility is both fragile and invaluable. The future of sports journalism will be defined by these voices: nimble, independent, digitally fluent, and deeply connected to audiences. They are shaping narratives, building communities, and expanding the boundaries of what it means to report, analyze, and engage. In this evolving ecosystem, journalism is no longer merely about informing. It is about shaping culture, connecting fans, and guiding perception with integrity and insight. The next generation of journalists has emerged not only as observers of the game, but as architects of the way it is understood, experienced, and remembered. There is a unique tension in modern sports journalism: the very figures entrusted to inform, analyze, and contextualize the game wield power that can rival the teams, executives, and players they cover. I first became conscious of this phenomenon during a particularly contentious offseason, when a journalist's coverage shaped a fan base's perception of a player's character, influenced trade discussions, and altered sponsor engagement before a single game had been played. The realization was sobering. The journalist's voice, amplified by social media, networks, and personal brand, could exert real-world influence on careers, franchises, and cultural narratives. When power is concentrated without sufficient accountability, the consequences can be profound. The danger of influence without accountability is not theoretical. It manifests in multiple, often subtle ways. A single report can frame a controversy, define a reputation, or reinforce bias, regardless of factual accuracy. I have observed situations in which journalists' interpretations, choice of language, or selective emphasis dictated public opinion. Fans, analysts, and even industry insiders internalize these narratives, shaping discourse and decision-making. In extreme cases, the weight of the journalist's authority eclipsed that of actual events or primary sources. This dynamic exposes a structural tension at the heart of modern sports media: the intersection of credibility, celebrity, and ethical responsibility. Historical examples illustrate the stakes. I recall a widely circulated story alleging off-field misconduct by a high-profile athlete. The journalist responsible had cultivated access, credibility, and a substantial audience. Once published, the narrative took on a life of its own. Teams, sponsors, and fans reacted before all facts were verified, demonstrating the cascading effects of influence. Even after corrections and clarifications were issued, the initial narrative persisted in fan memory. Online discourse and professional consequences. The episode revealed a harsh truth. Authority magnifies both impact and responsibility, and errors or biases can have long-lasting ramifications. The rise of journalist celebrities compounds this phenomenon. When reporters cultivate personal brands, social media followings, and corporate endorsements, the metrics of success shift from accuracy alone to engagement, virality, and personal influence. I have observed journalists navigate this duality, balancing factual reporting with the pressures of visibility, clicks, and social media amplification. The incentives created by this environment can blur ethical lines, encouraging sensationalism, framing bias, or prioritization of narrative appeal over rigorous verification. The result is an ecosystem in which power is concentrated, visibility is immediate, and consequences are far-reaching. Access journalism contributes to this concentration of power. Journalists with privileged relationships with teams, agents, and players acquire early insights, scoops, and interpretive authority. The audience relies on these individuals to shape understanding of trades, contracts, injuries, and controversies. Yet access is inherently uneven, often creating a hierarchy of influence in which a small number of voices dominate discourse. I have witnessed the effects firsthand. A single journalist's framing of a trade or draft decision could dominate forums, social media, and broadcast commentary, shaping perception even before official announcements. Influence becomes a currency with tangible repercussions. The psychology of fan trust amplifies these dynamics. Parasocial relationships and perceived intimacy create an environment where audiences internalize judgments, accept framing, and defer to perceived authority. I recall observing a controversial suspension where fans debated the athlete as character largely through the prism of journalist analysis rather than primary reporting or objective evidence. The framing established by a few influential voices determined fan reaction, sponsor engagement, and, in some cases, institutional response. Influence without accountability can thus extend far beyond mere opinion, affecting reputations, contracts, and careers. Digital platforms exacerbate these dynamics. Tweets, live streams, podcasts, and short-form content allow instantaneous dissemination of analysis, speculation, and commentary. I have seen journalists' posts amplified, dissected, and debated within minutes, creating rapid feedback loops that reinforce authority and influence. The speed and scale of digital communication can magnify errors, distort perception, and entrench narratives. Corrective measures are often insufficient. The initial framing persists, with enduring consequences for all parties involved. The capacity to shape perception is both powerful and precarious. Power also intersects with economic incentives. Journalists with significant followings can attract sponsorships, book deals, and network contracts. These financial stakes can influence coverage, prioritization of stories, and framing choices. I have observed subtle patterns in which high-profile journalists emphasize stories with viral potential or audience engagement value over less sensational but equally significant reporting. The tension between economic incentive, audience expectation, and professional integrity underscores the complexity of influence in modern sports media. There is a cultural dimension as well. Journalists' authority derives not only from expertise, but also from narrative control. I have noted that careers, legacies, and reputations can be constructed or dismantled through coverage alone. When authority is concentrated among a small cadre of high-profile voices, the potential for disproportionate impact grows. Fans, executives, and sponsors often defer to these figures, not solely based on merit, but on perceived insight, track record, and social influence. The systemic consequences are profound. A single narrative can define public perception, shape market behavior, and even influence strategic decisions. Yet, with concentrated power comes the possibility for accountability and reform. I have witnessed journalists reflect publicly, correct errors, and engage with criticism constructively. Platforms allow transparency, dialogue, and rapid clarification. Still, the challenge remains. The first framing often dominates memory and discussion, and influence can persist even after accountability is exercised. This highlights the structural fragility of the system and the enduring responsibility of those who wield authority in sports media. Looking forward, the future of journalism's celebrity class is both promising and perilous. Emerging reporters, independent voices, and digital natives are expanding reach, perspective, and narrative capacity. Yet the dynamics of influence, engagement, and accountability remain critical. I have reflected on the delicate balance required. Authority must be exercised with care. Integrity must guide decisions, and ethical judgment must temper ambition. The lessons are clear. Power without responsibility can reshape careers, culture, and fandom in ways both immediate and enduring. I have observed the subtle tension between transparency and influence. High-profile journalists are often called upon to comment, analyze, and opine while navigating complex relationships with sources, networks, and audiences. Missteps are magnified. Successes are amplified. The digital era ensures that every statement reverberates. Every framing is contested, and every interpretation becomes part of the historical record. Influence without accountability can thus become self-reinforcing, with long-term consequences for professional norms, cultural perception, and the trust audiences place in the profession. Ultimately, the central question persists. What happens when journalists become too powerful? Influence without checks can distort truth, magnify error, and shape perception in ways disconnected from fact. Authority, when exercised without rigorous ethical standards, has consequences for athletes, franchises, fans, and culture. I have reflected on moments where narratives framed by influential voices eclipsed objective reality, shaping debate, perception, and even institutional decision-making. The power of journalism is immense. Without responsibility, it can become equally dangerous. The future demands a recalibration of norms, transparency, and ethical oversight. Journalists must recognize the weight of their influence, balance authority with accountability, and navigate the intersection of fame, credibility, and responsibility. Audiences must remain vigilant, discerning, and critical, aware that even trusted voices carry subjective framing. The system is evolving, and its sustainability depends on the careful stewardship of influence. The rise of celebrity journalism is not inherently negative. It has enriched storytelling, expanded access, and increased engagement. Yet, unchecked power carries systemic risk. I have seen careers elevated, legacies redefined, and fan culture shaped in profound ways by journalists whose reach exceeds that of teams, executives, or players. The question is not whether influence exists, has always existed, but whether it is exercised responsibly, transparently, and with ethical rigor. In reflecting on this era, I am struck by the duality of opportunity and peril. Journalists possess the capacity to illuminate, contextualize, and deepen understanding. Yet the same power, if misused or unexamined, can distort, amplify bias, and generate consequences far beyond intention. Authority without accountability is a fragile construct, and the ethical responsibility of journalists is magnified in proportion to their reach. This is the defining tension of the celebrity journalist era. Influence is both an instrument and a burden, shaping the game, culture, and collective memory. As I reflect on the journey through this documentary, I am struck by the profound transformation not only of the game we call football, but of the voices that narrate it. Sports journalism, once a modest appendage of the game's scribbled notes in margins. Post-game radio summaries, newspaper columns printed late at night, has evolved into an institution of its own, wielding influence that rivals that of coaches, owners, and even players. The microphone, the pen, and the screen have become instruments of power, shaping perception, reputation, and culture in ways that are both visible and invisible, immediate and enduring. Football has always been a game of heroes, triumphs, and defeats. But the telling of the story has become just as consequential as the plays themselves. The evolution of sports journalism into a celebrity class has irrevocably altered the landscape, and with it, the delicate balance of truth, influence, and accountability. I think back to the early days when reporters were invisible participants in the spectacle. They documented the game, recorded the statistics, and offered context, but they rarely became part of the story themselves. Fans revered players, coaches were mythologized, and the journalists' voices were secondary, almost incidental. Yet even then, the seeds of influence were planted. Every choice of language, every narrative angle, every highlighted moment had the capacity to shape public perception. I recall reading old columns that immortalized victories and cast long shadows over losses, even without the reach of television, radio, or the internet. The written word held power to shape careers, reputations, and legacies. The journalist's role was subtle, but its impact was real, quietly echoing in the memories of fans who relied on these accounts to understand the game they loved. With the advent of television, the journalist moved from the margins into living rooms. Suddenly, personalities were visible, voices were amplified, and commentary could rival the spectacle itself. I remember watching broadcasts where the analyst's voice became inseparable from the game, shaping my own perception of events, informing my understanding, and guiding my emotions. The excitement, the tension, and even the heartbreak of football were filtered through these narrators. The game had always been physical, visceral, and unpredictable. But the media lens added an additional dimensional layer of interpretation that transformed raw action into narrative, assigning heroes, villains, and moral weight to each play. It was here that the power of the journalist began to shift from observer to arbiter, from chronicler to participant. The rise of cable networks, insider culture, and the internet accelerated this transformation. Information became a commodity, speed became currency, and the journalist's brand became inseparable from their reporting. I watched as names became familiar, voices became trusted, and analysis became a form of entertainment. Fans didn't just consume the game, they consumed the interpretation, debate, and personality of those who reported it. Insider access, leaks, and scoops began to define reputations not only of the players, but of the journalists themselves. I came to realize that in this ecosystem, influence could shape perception before a ball was snapped, a contract signed, or a decision made. The game was no longer contained on the field. It was a constantly evolving narrative, mediated by those who commanded attention. But with influence comes responsibility, and the consequences of misjudgment are magnified in proportion to reach. Careers have been defined by a headline, a segment, or a post. Players have been celebrated or condemned not solely by their performance, but by the lens through which journalists framed their actions. I have observed, and sometimes felt personally, the weight of this power. How narratives can elevate, distort, or destroy. Missteps, whether due to haste, bias, or incomplete information, ripple through communities, fan bases, and professional networks. Corrections are often insufficient. Once the perception has been established, it lingers. Influence is both fleeting and enduring, immediate and historical, a paradox that every journalist must navigate with care. The celebrity of the journalist has also altered the culture of the game itself. Players are aware that performance is evaluated not only by coaches and fans, but by those who shape the story. Agents, teams, and sponsors engage strategically with the media, understanding the leverage that narratives provide. I have seen careers rise and fall based as much on perception as on execution. Football, always a game of physical mastery, is now entwined with media mastery, and the journalist sits at the nexus of this intersection. The balance of power has shifted, subtly, yet irrevocably, from the gridiron to the microphone, from the field to the studio. Yet this evolution is not inherently negative. Journalism has brought insight, context, and understanding to fans who crave more than mere scores. It has given voice to overlooked perspectives, uncovered injustice, and illuminated complexities that escape casual observation. I have followed journalists who challenged conventional wisdom, held institutions accountable, and deepened the cultural significance of the game. The profession, when practiced with integrity, enriches football, connecting fans to the human drama, strategic depth, and historical resonance of every season. The microphone, like the pen, can honor the sport as much as it interprets it. The challenge lies in balancing this power with accountability. Social media, independent platforms, and celebrity branding magnify both reach and risk. Mistakes are amplified. Errors linger. I've seen reporters navigate these treacherous waters, carefully weighing the imperatives of speed, accuracy, and engagement. Ethical judgment is constantly tested, and the stakes are existential for both credibility and influence. Every narrative carries weight. Every framing contributes to memory, and every decision reverberates beyond the immediate context of the game. The responsibility is enormous, yet inseparable from the privilege of voice. As I reflect on my own experiences, I recognize that football has changed journalists as much as journalists have changed football. The game demands analysis, interpretation, and engagement, shaping the skills, priorities, and perspectives of those who cover it. I have learned to measure not only the significance of a play, but also the implications of how it is described, discussed, and remembered. The journalist becomes both participant and observer, custodian and interpreter, accountable to both truth and audience. The relationship is symbiotic. The game provides substance, the journalist provides narrative, and the interplay defines how both are experienced, remembered, and understood. The ethical dimensions are equally profound. Influence without reflection can distort truth, amplify bias, and entrench narratives that outlive events themselves. Journalists operate within a delicate ecosystem, balancing access, credibility, and authority with moral and professional responsibility. I have witnessed moments when even well-intentioned reporting unintentionally harmed reputations or misrepresented events. A reminder that the stakes are personal, professional, and cultural. Power without accountability is a dangerous instrument. When wielded thoughtfully, it becomes a force for understanding, connection, and insight. In the end, the story of journalist celebrity is inseparable from the story of football itself. Both have evolved, expanded, and intertwined in ways that are fascinating, complex, and consequential. The game has shaped journalists, instilling discipline, insight, and the drive to interpret, while journalists have shaped the game's memory, meaning, and mythology. Fans, players, and institutions alike are participants in this dynamic, shaped by narratives, perspective, and authority. Understanding this interplay is essential to appreciating not just the spectacle on the field, but the layered reality that surrounds it. I am left with a meditation on truth, influence, and legacy. Every narrative, every voice, every piece of analysis contributes to collective memory. The responsibility of shaping perception is enormous, yet unavoidable. Journalists have the power to elevate, inform, and clarify, but they must wield that power consciously, ethically, and with humility. Influence carries weight, and the legacy of reporting is inseparable from the trust it engenders, the narratives it constructs, and the culture it shapes. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Journalism has transformed football into a multidimensional experience, extending the game beyond the field into culture, identity, and memory. At the same time, football has transformed journalists, demanding skill, reflection, and ethical rigor in the exercise of influence. The microphone carries as much consequence as the football, the pen as much as the cleat, and the voice of the reporter as much authority as the roar of the crowd. To navigate this intersection is to engage with responsibility, integrity, and a profound awareness of the impact of words on perception, legacy, and the collective memory of the game. This documentary concludes with a recognition of that duality, the power and the responsibility, the influence and the accountability, the game and the narrator. Football and journalism are entwined in a shared narrative, one in which every story told contributes to a broader understanding. Every voice matters, and every choice resonates. The legacy of both sport and media depends not just on what happens on the field, but on how it is remembered, analyzed, and interpreted. As I step back from this exploration, I am reminded that influence is not merely a reflection of skill or insight. It is a responsibility, an ethical obligation, and a trust bestowed by both the game and its audience. In the silence after the crowd fades, it is the journalist who gives shape, meaning, and permanence to the moment. That is the privilege, the burden, and the defining reality of the modern sports media era. Every word, every narrative, every interpretation matters. The echo of the game persists, not just in memory, but in story. And in that story lies the power, responsibility, and enduring influence of those who hold the microphone, the pen, and the platform.